Yeah, there is. Thank you. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. We had a great day yesterday talking about the reproductive technologies and several important dimensions of governance. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the framework that we want to develop for germline gene editing. And we begin with the risk-benefit analysis in relation to rights, and Rob Califf is going to chair this session, so I'll hand over to Rob. Thank you. There's one GDPR issue, and that is, as yesterday, we are webcasting this. So if anyone objects to being on a video, please could they let us know, and then we'll make sure we can accommodate it. Thank you.
All right, well, good morning. It's a privilege to be here in this pretty amazing setting, although I have to say it feels very old-fashioned to have the lecturer 30 yards removed from the audience, especially given the topics that we're going to talk about today. So the first topic this morning is one that I find fascinating, so I'm glad we're covering it. Risk-benefit analysis in relation to rights of future people and long-term follow-up. And having been FDA commissioner, this is something that we ended up spending a lot of time on in a different topic, which is the opioid epidemic in the U.S., where the issue at stake in general for the FDA is the risk-benefit for the individual on whom the therapy is intended. But when you consider the societal impact beyond the person for whom the therapy is intended, then you get into a whole different set of issues for which there are few precedents and not very much of a standard around the world in the sense of regulation. So this intersection of regulation, law, and ethics here as it relates to this interesting topic will be the subject of discussion this morning. So to lead us off this morning, we have Christina Berg from the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Let's see if, yes. Are you on? Yes. Come right on up.
So, hello everybody, good morning. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. And I am a professor in obstetrics and gynecology in Göteborg in the southwestern part of Sweden. And I'm a clinician, and I will talk about short and long-term follow-up of the IVF children. I have no conflict of interest. Just to give you a short background first, there are now more than 7 million children born around the world after IVF, and up to above 6% of the national cohorts in Europe are a result of ART, and more than 70,000 children are born in Sweden. Even if I will talk about singletons mostly, I will wish to emphasize that the biggest problem still in the world is the high rate of multiple birth. It is decreasing, that is correct, but it's going quite slowly, I would say. So the multiple birth rate in Europe and US is still, as you see, around 20%, and some higher in the US. And there are still triplets being born. So as I said, I will go to singleton because then you can roll out the influence of the multiples. I show you here several systematic reviews comparing singletons after ART versus singleton after spontaneous conception. And it is preterm birth. Oh, this one it was. It's preterm birth rate and low birth weight. And as you can see, the ART, they are around 2 to 3 times higher rate of being born preterm or to a low birth weight compared to spontaneously conceived. It is getting some better, so the latest systematic reviews, you see the figures are a bit lower. And that's maybe easier to see on this slide. We are a group of Nordic researchers from the 4 Nordic countries, having created a big database located in Copenhagen, where it's now more than, it's around 170,000 art kids and 7 million kids from spontaneous conception. It's in fact all kids born since the start, both from art, and all children from spontaneous conception. And here is a paper a few years ago. It's called Trend Over Time. And you can see that these are born preterm, and this is the IVF kids. And it's a quite dramatic decrease in the rate of being born preterm for the art singletons. No such pattern from the spontaneous children. And the same is true for small for gestational age. These are the art singletons. You see it's a 50% decrease, and the similar for intrauterine death for the art children and stillbirth. So something is going on, and when this was published, the media was very much interested. You know, the media is interested when it goes good and when it goes bad, so that's what they like. And so they asked, how comes this? What have you done? And we didn't know really what was going on. We were just happy about these results. But so they asked, is it other stimulation, other culture condition or whatever? But I think it is mainly characteristic of the women being treated, because 20 years ago there were more infertile, if I can say so. They had a longer period of infertility and long waiting list, etc. Nowadays, it's much shorter of that, so it might be the reason why it's getting better. This slide shows cryo children. You know, cryo preservation is being a bigger and bigger part of IVF, and the reason for that is that we have a new cryo technique which works much better than the old one. This is the vitrification and compared to the slow freezing, and also the blastocyst transfer. So the combination of vitrification and blastocyst works very well. So that's the main reason why the cryo technique increases, and thus the cryo children. And there's a lot of studies showing that the cryo children, they have a lower risk of being born preterm and to a low birth weight. This is a sort of cumulative meta-analysis, and so they add one more study, and you see the estimate and the confidence interval to the left. Similar, or in the opposite, I should say, they are bigger than the children from fresh transfer. So they are have a higher birth weight and also a higher rate of being large for gestational age. The reason for that, we don't know. There have been 3 theories, I think. One would be that you don't have the influence of the very hyperstimulated endometrium. Another thing is selection. You select the strongest, or what you could say, who survive cryopreservation. Or third, that it's something going on during the cryo technique, some epigenetic or whatever. We don't know that yet. Birth defects, there are also numerous data around the world that the IVF singleton has a higher rate of a birth defect, and that is around 50%, between 30 and 70%. It's not a particular birth defect, it's all over the scenario. It's heart defects, the most common, it's gastrointestinal, urological, etc. And this Conactas, this Nordic group, published a study just a year ago from this big database, and we saw the same pattern with this, 20-30% increased risk. Unfortunately, there were no such trend over time, as I showed you for the preterm and low birth weight. So the rate is similar in the later cohorts compared to the former ones. A good thing, or something we were very worried about, was that when ICSI turned up, that should cause birth defects or whatever is a much more invasive technique, and it could well be dangerous. And it's just started, you know, with the ICSI. But and now comparing the children born after ICSI versus the standard IVF, one sees no differences in birth defects, and that's very good, both for us, of course, and for the parents and children. There seems to be no difference in birth defects. So I turn to long-term follow-up. There is not so much studies yet because they are not that old, but I will briefly turn you upon growth, cognitive and psychomotor development, mental disorders, autistic disorders, school performances, cancer, cardiovascular risk, diabetes mellitus, and puberty development. First, for growth, this is a systematic review from Denmark, covering 20 studies with a follow-up up to 22 years and 4,000 IVF children, and then controls. And they saw no difference at all in weight and no differences in height for the children. For the cognitive and psychomotor development, there are studies also around the world. It's from the Netherlands here, it's from Australia and Denmark, and they neither found any difference in cognitive or psychomotor development. The latest study, the latest systematic review is from Australia, and here there were children more than 4 years, more studies, some conflicting results, no problem with the IVF children, but some conflicting results with the ICSI children, both versus spontaneous and versus standard IVF. But again, it was mainly with the multiples, so it disappeared when one stratified for multiples, and also it was mainly observed in subgroups. Cerebral palsy is another very important outcome, I think. It raises a lot of concern for parents, of course, and politicians, etc. And the first studies, they were all from the Nordic countries. It is one from Sweden, one from Denmark, and one from Finland. And they did show an increased rate of cerebral palsy among all ART children compared to all spontaneously conceived. But that was also the same in singletons. So this was quite a worrying data. Later publication from the same authors, however, having a bigger population, and when they adjusted for multiplicity and also for gestational age, these over-risk disappeared. Well, there are coming new studies all the time. Well, the science is fresh, is also new data all the time. So this is a recent study from Australia. It's not that big, but so it's 4,000 something IVF children, or only 3,000 IVF children, and it did show an increase in rate in cerebral palsy among the IVF singletons, but it's only based on quite few, so it has to be taken with caution, I think. Autistic disorders, the first study is also coming from the Scandinavian countries, showing no difference in autistic disorders. The biggest study was from Sweden. It was published in JAMA 2013, covering 30,000 IVF children and 2.5 million 2.5 million children from spontaneous conception. And they did not find any difference in autistic disorders, neither overall or for singletons, but there was an over-risk in mental retardation, but not if one separated it for singletons only. Next study is from the US, it's from California, Dimitri Kissin. He compared a large group of IVF children, 42,000 up to 5 years, and checked for autistic disorders, and it was a 0.8% rate of that in the ART singletons. When he compared to ICSI, he found an over-risk, however, of 1.65. They had no spontaneous control group in this study. This is from Denmark again, an overview of any kind of psychiatric disorders. and they found no overall risk for the ICSI IVF children compared to spontaneous conception. It was any psychiatric disorder, mental retardation, behavioral and emotional disorder, etc. School performances is a good outcome, I think, to check for cognitive development. And the reason for that is that all children go to school, so you get a high number of events. And this is a study from Sweden where we compared 15-year-old children. It's when they qualify from the primary school. And it was 8,000 ART singletons and 1.5 million spontaneously conceived children. And this is a busy slide, but you can, what we checked was the total score. That's what they get when they finish school. And we also checked the main topics, mathematics, English, Swedish, and physical education. And overall, before adjustment, the ART singletons were 10% better, had 10% higher scores, but if one adjusted, we found no differences. And the main confounder was parental education. So the IVF parents had a higher educational level compared to the spontaneous. So that was the main confounder. We also checked approved in mathematics, Swedish, and English, and that's you need to go to the secondary school, and a variable called poor school performance. In the same pattern here, the IVF singletons performed better, but when adjusted, it was similar. I turn to cancer. There have been 3 large studies comparing cancer in IVF children compared to spontaneously conceived. This first is here from UK, published in New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago. It's from Alistair Sutcliffe, and they had about 100,000 IVF children in this cohort, and they found no overall increased risk for cancer among the children. In some subgroups, hepatoblastoma and rhabdomyosarcoma, there was an over-risk of these figures, but you see they are based on very few children. The second large study is from this CONATAS, the Nordic group, again, around the same number of children, 91,000 compared to spontaneously conceived, a bit longer follow-up, 9.5 years. And these are the rates in the Nordic countries. And putting statistics on it, we neither found any differences neither in the crude or the adjusted analysis. From US came this year a big study published in JAMA Pediatrics from Spector is the first author. And you see they have an even larger cohort of IVF kids and big of spontaneous also. They found these rates of cancer, and when one checked for significances, there was a borderline of what you call it. It is in fact not significant, but it's just on the border for any cancer. Subgroups again, for 2 subgroups, hepatic cancer and embryonal tumors, they found an over-risk. And the last study is not that big. It's from the Netherlands. It covers 24,000 IVF children, but I show it because they have a control group of subfertile women. And that's always a problem with all these studies, that you compare the ART technique, you think that they are also a different characteristic of the mothers of the couple. But here they have a control group of subfertile people who do conceive by themselves. And anyhow, they found no over-risk in any of these comparisons. Cardiovascular diseases is, of course, not known so much yet because the kids are not that old, but anyhow, there have been some studies and put together here in a meta-analysis from China, 19 studies, 2,000 IVF children and controls. And what they found, what other studies have found, is an over-risk of systolic and diastolic blood pressure. It's not big differences, 2-3 millimeters, which on the individual level might not differ, but on a population level it makes it can make a difference for adults. For BMI, they found no difference. There have been 2 studies the last year causing more attention, and they are both from Switzerland. They investigated a group of IVF children and a group of spontaneously conceived children, and did very careful investigation of the cardiovascular system and found adverse things for the IVF children with thicker intima in the carotid artery, etc. And what they did also 5 years later, they reinvestigated the same group of children, and they were now 16, 17 years old, and what they found a similar pattern with a poor vascular system for the IVF children and a higher systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Diabetes, there are very few studies yet on diabetes. Diabetes is an important disease also, I think. First, it's the highest level is in young children around 10 to 14 years, so that could be an option to check for diabetes. And it's also increasing in the world, and particularly, in fact, in the Scandinavian countries. I don't know why. So this is a study from Denmark, where they did not, it's not so many IVF children, they did not, however, found any increased risk for diabetes. We have just performed a study in Sweden, it's not published yet, but where we investigated 40 all IVF children, all IVF singletons, I should say, 47,000 compared to 3 million. And we have a lot of registers in Sweden, which we can cross-link to each other. There are 4 or 5 registers just for diabetes, with child diabetes, etc., and drug registers and so on. So we cross-linked these and found this number of diabetes in the IVF children and per 100,000 person year calculated. If we did adjusted analysis, there were no overall risk for the IVF children, but for the cryo babies, for the cryo singletons, there were a 50% higher risk, both compared to fresh IVF children and spontaneously conceived. So reproductive health, I have to hurry. There have been some studies from Brussels, and the first study they found no differences between ART children and spontaneously conceived. A little later on, they have found lower semen parameters in the boys conceived after ICSI. So the key message for the short-term outcome is that there is an increased rate of neonatal outcome like preterm and low birth weights, also congenital birth defects, no differences between IVF and ICSI, and cryopreservation have a lower risk of preterm birth but a higher risk of big babies. And for the long-term outcome, growth, no differences, cancer, no or small differences, never development seems reassuring. As academic performance and autistic disorders, slightly higher blood pressure and adverse cardiac diastolic function, lipid metabolism similar, and maybe some increase in diabetes. Thank you. Yeah.
Which is a challenge for any new reproductive technology to try and show any difference. And the second was a point that you made about socioeconomic groups, because I'm slightly worried that you're always comparing, you hinted that maybe the higher socioeconomic groups are actually accessing the reproductive technologies, but you're actually comparing with the general population, apart from education. And I just wondered whether or not you would actually use that adjustment right across the...
No. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that differs quite a lot between different countries. In the Scandinavian countries, IVF is public available, so there are not so much differences anyhow in socioeconomy compared to maybe US, etc. But there are differences, as we saw for school performances. So I think one really should adjust for these things. They do affect much more than you would think. But many of these studies have not been done that, no.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'd just like to ask a little more about the frozen embryo children born large for gestational age. I know it's just a small group. Has anybody followed up these children to look at potential impacts on health or cognitive functioning?
No, not yet, no. But I think also that's a very important thing, and particularly since cryo technique is increasing so much, and you know this freeze all. Some units freeze everything today and don't transfer any fresh embryos any longer.
And do you have any hypotheses about what might happen?
Well, yes, I told you there are 3 hypotheses. This with the very hyperstimulated endometrium. We have checked that, I haven't time to show you, but we have checked that in one study, and it doesn't seem to be that. Next, it's selection, that it should be the strongest children who survive, but now with the vitrification, all embryos survive, so I don't, maybe I think it is something with the cryo, that something happens during the cryo. I don't know more, no.
We have a question or a comment back here. You've stimulated a lot of interest here.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. So I think as we think about the potential relationships between IVF itself and these outcomes that you've looked at, we absolutely have to bear in mind that the majority of the patients have subfertility of some sort or another, and that perhaps that really plays into these relationships and associations that you've observed. And it's, of course, very tricky to separate that from the ovarian stimulation and possibly egg quality issues, embryo quality issues, as well as the ART technologies themselves. So it was just a comment. Thank you.
There have been, in fact, done a few sibling studies. I don't know if you're aware of that. That's one mother do deliver one art child and one spontaneously, and that's not so uncommon. And the biggest study is from Denmark in that, and in summary what they found that it was both the technique and the mother characteristic which affected the neonatal outcome. So it was in fact a combination.
Yeah, and that's the tricky thing, separating the one from the other when we think about this technology with respect to germline gene editing and gene editing. Yeah, thank you.
Speaking of separation, can you just comment on participation in these follow-up studies? Obviously, these children didn't consent at the beginning.
No. If you check for these, for example, what I show you for your cardiologist yourself, these cardiology studies is of course a big problem. And I mean, they ask, you know nothing about selection there. So it's of course a selection bias. But if you go to the registry studies, and that's the good with the registry studies, there are no selection. But there are other disadvantages, of course. But yeah.
So there is not a consent for these children?
You mean from the start?
Or obviously the parents would be giving it from the start.
It was so in the beginning, particularly for Brussels. They signed such a statement that they should be, but even if they do sign it, they don't show up when it's time. But otherwise, there has not been that, no.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was great. And Johnny reminded me, we're asked to stay up. There's a name card for you to...
Later or now?
No, now
okay,
apparently.
Okay.
I violated protocol to begin with, but we're back on track now. So the next talk will be Susan Golumbach from Cambridge, who will focus on the psychological issues and follow-up.
Just waiting for my slides.
I'm resisting the temptation to get into a fight about cardiology versus fall. But
Whoops.
okay. We'll do that later.
Thank you. Oh dear, I keep losing them now. Great. Well, good morning, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about the other side of the coin in the way, looking at the long-term follow-up of children from a psychological perspective. So in the very early days of IVF, a number of concerns were expressed about the potentially negative psychological consequences for children of being conceived in this way. It was thought that perhaps parents may be overprotective of their children, they may have unduly high expectations of them or of themselves as parents, and this might lead to psychological problems for the child. There was also concern that other people might treat IVF differently because there was a lot of suspicion in the very early days, and certainly mothers I spoke to soon after IVF became possible talked about being shunned in the street, being concerned because grandparents may treat their children differently. And just to give you one example of a mother said to me, "I think my mother-in-law thought he was going to come out with two heads. She does love him, I'm sure she does, but there's always been that little something. Even when she came to the hospital after he was born, she didn't pick him up." So these kinds of anxieties were around, but not for very long. They soon dissipated, and people no longer think these kinds of things about IVF children. But in a way, more fundamental concerns were expressed about children born through donated egg, sperm, or gametes. And these concerns are to some extent still with us today. So really there are two main anxieties about these children. Firstly, that the parents may not fully accept a non-genetic child as their own. And secondly, because until recently, donor conception was surrounded in secrecy, there was concern that keeping the child's genetic origin secret might have a detrimental effect on children's well-being. This came from research in adoption, which showed that adopted children benefit from information about their background, and also the family therapy literature, which talked about secrets in families separating those who know the secret, in this case the parents, from those who don't, in this case the child. And the Warnock Committee in 1984 addressed this issue. They said AID, which is the term that used to be used for donor conception, AID children may feel obscurely that they're being deceived by their parents, that they're in some way different from their peers, and that the men whom they regard as their fathers are not their real fathers. So at the Centre for Family Research, we've been carrying out 2 longitudinal studies looking at children's psychological well-being and also the quality of relationships with their parents. The first was a European study of assisted reproduction families, which focused on children born in the mid-1980s. And then more recently, the Millennium Study of assisted reproduction families that focused on children born in the year 2000. So these studies focused on 4 key questions. Firstly, does the quality of parenting experienced by assisted reproduction children differ from that of naturally conceived children? Secondly, are assisted reproduction children at greater risk for psychological problems than naturally conceived children? Thirdly, what do parents tell children about their conception? And finally, how do children themselves feel about being donor conceived? Now, the approach we take to doing this work, as far as I'm aware, we're the only group that has followed up children's psychological development and parenting over time from childhood to late adolescence.
We, in terms of the sample sizes that Christina talked about, ours seem very tiny indeed. I mean, we think we're doing well if we get 100 families in each group. Our approach is very different. We visit the families at home, at each suite, probably twice. We spend many, many hours with the families and doing a multitude, really, of assessments. So it's very in-depth. Because the samples are small, the extent to which they're representative is very important. And as I'll come to later, also attrition over time is a big issue in this research. So we take a multi-informant approach. We get data from each parent, from the children, and also the children's teachers. We also, in terms of our methods, adopt a multi-method approach. So we use standardized interviews designed to assess quality of parent-child relationships. We also observe each parent interacting with their children. These are videoed and coded to again look at the quality of the relationship between the parent and the child. We use a number of standardized questionnaires for which there's also general population data, and also standardized tests with the children. So in the first study, this was a collaboration between the UK, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands. And we had between 100, 120 families in each type, so IVF families, donor insemination families, and comparison groups of adoptive families where children lack a genetic connection to parents, and 120 natural conception parents who were matched for demographic characteristics. And these families were seen 3 times when the children were 6, 12, and again at 18. So this was the first in-depth study of IVF and DI children. And in spite of the concerns that had been raised about these children, we actually found that where there were differences, this reflected a higher quality of parenting in the assisted reproduction families, and that the children showed high levels of adjustment, and that was true even in the DI families where children lacked a genetic connection to their father. But one very striking finding, and quite unexpected, was that less than 10% of the donor insemination parents had disclosed the genetic origin to their children. And when we asked them why they'd made this decision, it was because they were worried that telling their children would interfere with the good relationship the child had with a non-genetic parent. So it was really based on fear of this relationship being jeopardized in some way. So over time, parents were being more encouraged to be open with their children. And the first study, we'd hoped to look at the difference between children who were aware of their conception and those who weren't, but we couldn't do that because there were so few. So 15 years later, we started a new study at the Millennium. Because the IVF children were doing so well, we didn't include them in this study. We just focused on those born through donated eggs, which had become quite widely used by this time, donated sperm, and our comparison group of natural conception families. This study is still ongoing. So far, we've seen the families when the children were 1, 2, 3, 7, 10, and 14 years old, and we're just about to go back and see them as they're reaching age 20. So again, the findings replicated the first study. We found very positive relationships between parents and children, high levels of child adjustment, but even by this later date, very few parents had been open with their children, more than in the first study, but still only 39% of egg donation families and only 29% of donor insemination families had children been informed about their conception. One advantage of longitudinal research is that you can begin to look at predictors of adjustment over time and to some extent look at causation. And what we found is that those parents who had been open with their children in their preschool years had better relationships with their teenagers at age 14. And this actually came from independent data from mothers and from the teenagers themselves, which provides more validation that actually early disclosures seem to be a good thing. Now, we were also, we interviewed the young people themselves, so by the time they were 14, more had been told about their conception. So we were able to interview all of those who were aware that they were donor conceived. And the large majority were not concerned about it. So just to give you an example from one teenager who said, "I don't think it really affects anything. I consider that my dad is still my dad." But in spite of having positive relationships with their parents, many of them did express an interest in knowing more about their donor. Some just wanted information about the donor, and others wanted to meet. But this certainly wasn't true for all of them. There was a lot of variation, and some young people had no interest in this at all. Now, because the law then changed in the UK to ban anonymous donation, and in 2023, the first children will be able to request the identity of their donor in this country, we were interested to know about the experiences of young people who were aware of their donor conception. So we collaborated with the Donor Sibling Registry in the United States to survey young people and adults who were aware of their donor conception. And we were interested firstly in why they were interested in their donor and their donor siblings. And it really seemed to be very much to do with their identity, to have a better understanding of where they came from, who they were. They were interested in resemblances with the donor and their donor siblings, but also a bit about the family history. So they wanted to have some understanding of their ancestry. They wanted to be able to tell a more complete story of who they were and where they came from. We also found, just like in our own in-depth study in the UK, that the age at which children find out about their donor conception is a very important variable. So again, with this data, we found that those who were told about their donor conception when they were young were more likely to be accepting. Those who found out later were more likely to feel either deceived by their parents, angry with them, and to be distressed about their discovery. So from this research, it seems that assisted reproduction children have good relationships with their parents and show high levels of psychological well-being, which in a way, in hindsight, isn't particularly surprising because these are very wanted children. But the research also points to the importance of disclosing to children when they're young. And actually this also was the conclusion of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, who looked at this issue and produced a report in 2003. So how does this all relate, or can it inform us in any way about germline editing? Certainly, it seems very likely that openness is going to be a good thing in this situation too. But also, it's going to be very important if the children are going to be followed up, because it's not possible to follow up children to get informed consent if they're not aware of why they're in the study. In terms of what we might expect from these children, in terms of their psychological well-being, the research to date suggests that actually what matters for these children in terms of their well-being, their relationship with their parents, is the quality of the relationship with their parents. Matters more about whether or not they're genetically connected to their parents, or in terms of how they were conceived, whether or not by assisted reproduction. But also these children might very well want to know more about how they came to be. And the kinds of questions they may ask is what actually happened to them as embryos and why. I've been asked to say a little bit about informed consent, so I'll just say a bit about how we do it in our research. So at each phase of the study, we do this again. When the children are very young, then consent, written informed consent, just comes from the parent, although it's from each parent separately. From as young as 5, or even earlier sometimes, we try to get verbal assent, or we do get verbal assent from the children, which really means just trying to ensure that they understand what the research is about, that there are no right or wrong answers, that they don't have to do all of it or any of it. And also our researchers are very well trained in how to detect distress in children so that they're able to stop the interview and deal with any distress shown by them. Now, as I said before, something that's really important in this research is trying to reduce the number of dropouts as much as possible, because otherwise we're going to get sample bias. And so at each phase, we obtain written consent from parents to contact them for the next phase, which doesn't commit them to taking part, just to us getting in touch to tell them about the next phase. We also obtain consent to contact them through the National Health Service Register in this country, which is something that operates through the Office of National Statistics. And more recently, we also obtain written consent to contact them online through Google, Facebook, if they move home. We actually find that those who drop out tend to do so at the very beginning, and they're the ones who are not wanting to tell children about their origin. So I think they worry that by taking part in the research, that this is going to jeopardize the secrecy. But in fact, we also, the families who are in the study are very committed. We stay in touch with them throughout the year. We send Christmas cards and newsletters and all kinds of things. And often they contact us to say, you haven't been to see us for a while, when are you coming back? So particularly for our IVF families, you know, we had something like a 95% cooperation rate throughout the study, because they could see, they understood why it was important, because we didn't know anything about the families. And the last thing I'd like to mention, again, I was asked to talk a bit about intergenerational studies. There haven't as yet been any intergenerational studies of psychological well-being in children born through assisted reproduction, but there have been studies of psychological development and parenting in the general population. I think the most notable one to mention, which is a very good model, is the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children that's still ongoing. So it recruited mothers, pregnant mothers in the early 90s, followed up the children, and now that study is following up the children's children. And that study takes genetic measures as well as health and physical and psychological ones. So, as I said before, the key challenge, though, to any follow-up study is attrition, sample attrition. And I think that was something that would need to be thought about very carefully. Just like to thank all the researchers. Obviously, I haven't been doing all of this work myself. There's a large team at the Centre for Family Research, and also to our funders, mainly the Wellcome Trust, the US National Institutes for Health, and the SRC in the UK. Thank you.
We've had two great talks. Now let's have some discussion. Yes, Doug.
Thank you for a very interesting and wonderful example of how to do a study where people feel appreciated and part of an ongoing initiative to understand their reproductive choices and difficulties. In other cohorts involving children who then reach the maturity, or either by statute or considered to be mature minors, there's been a very high attrition rate because they didn't have this sense of involvement and the trust that you seem to have engendered in your cohort. So some cohorts, when they call up to get the consent of the now so-called adult, presumed adult, find different reactions like duh and never call them before noon and all that kind of stuff. So the attrition rate is high, and they're moving towards a notification with opt-out for teenagers, simply saying you might not know that your parents enrolled you. However, you are in. If you want to stay in, contact us, rather than trying to get the traditional informed consent. So notification and opt-out, because of the mercurial nature of teenagers.
I see. So I think, just to sort of reiterate what I said before, I think maintaining a relationship with these children right from the beginning is very, very important. But interestingly, for many of them, they kind of forget about us or why they're in the study till we come back, particularly IVF children who are genetically related to both of their parents. And the 18-year-olds we followed up, a lot of them said, oh, we'd forgotten all about it. We've forgotten about being born through IVF till your researchers come back and speak to us again. So for some of them, they don't stay in because they identify with that particular family type, but I think because they have an ongoing relationship. And I think that's why it's important to see them fairly frequently through childhood, because they remember who we are.
Doug? Two questions, Susan. One
Yes.
was this point about carefully selecting groups, and within your cohort, socioeconomic factors are obviously going to be a massive thing, and you made the point about wanted children. Clearly that is something that you did select your families on, is that correct?
That we did. Yes, so we tried to match as closely as possible on demographic factors. It's very difficult because for the IVF and the donor-conceived families, because they've gone through years of infertility, they come to parenthood much older and they have fewer children. Then we select the natural conception group, usually through maternity ward records. If we match for age of the mother, then they have fewer children. And so it's a very difficult balancing act, and it's actually hard. So some of this we do match as well as we can, and when it's not possible to be perfect, then we deal with this through statistical analyses. I don't think there's any straightforward answer because it's just the nature of the sample that assisted reproduction parents are older when they have children and they have fewer children. We have tried to match with some of our studies with a natural conception group who've experienced infertility, like a year of infertility, and then become pregnant without high-tech intervention, through linking up through the Oxford Record linkage study. But that was we were very fortunate to be able to do that. It is quite hard to do this matching.
My second point is, so I've been somebody that's taken informed consent for years, whether it be for procedures or for clinical trials, and I'm curious about the concept of assent from a 5-year-old, right? I'm just saying that I went to see my grandchildren last night.
Yes.
Said to my 5-year-old granddaughter, would you like to do your reading tonight with me? And the answer was no. So I'm just trying to get the view of how you actually
Yes.
Consider your approach.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, I was just lovely. No, but I was saying it's quite a difficult thing because I know the rigors that we go to do informed consent.
Yes.
And a 5-year-old, as Rob has already indicated, a 5-year-old can be easily bribed to say yes, because I did not go, if you read your book, I'll give you a sweet. So I'm just trying to think of how you actually do that. And is it actually meaningful? Because I think there is a...
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we do as much as we can. I think the children actually usually love taking part in our research because they often do tests with puppets, drawing, building things, So actually, they don't understand, in a sense, what we're looking at. They don't understand necessarily why we're there. But the main thing is that we want them to be comfortable and we want them to enjoy the experience. And it's really much more about them not doing things that makes them feel sad or unhappy or anxious in any way. And so just reassuring them that they don't have to do these things and coming back to that throughout the tests. If they look at all uncomfortable, just making sure that, they want to carry on. So it's more that kind of thing, because obviously they can't understand the complexity of why we're there and what we're doing. So we do speak to them, and we just kind of make sure all the way through that they're not being upset by us.
All right, we have a number of comments or questions, so this is take them as, you think we need to move along, Johnny? Okay, so only if there's something very specific to this.
Yes, so Sarah Norcross from the Progress Educational Trust. Thanks for a lovely talk, Susan. I wondered whether your research had looked at, in families where there is a genetic link to the child, what their parents had told them about their conception, about the science and techniques involved, and about the causes for that, because I think that might be interesting for what parallels could be drawn for if and when genome editing is used.
So you're talking about IVF children who are genetically linked to both parents?
Yes.
Yes. Well, about half of them talk to their young children. I mean, most of them know as they grow older, but in terms of speaking to young children, about half of them do. It's usually, it's much more casual. You know, the parents are much less anxious about telling them about this. And it usually comes up more spontaneously if there's a television program about IVF, or it used to be in the old days of Robert Winston always being on the television, and some of the parents, you know, from his clinic would say, oh, that's, you know, the doctor who helped you to be born. So they don't go into great detail. And I think some parents just feel, well, you know, you don't normally talk to children about how they were conceived, and there's no need for us to do this either. So probably about 50% do with young children, but it's in quite vague terms, usually, yeah.
All right, we have one last question. Well, yeah, one. Well, and we'll save the rest for the panel.
I understand that it's rare, but I'm wondering if a child actually rejects the study entirely and wishes that his or her data be removed, is that possible?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And occasionally parents do this as well, and we do that, of course, yeah.
From as far back
All of
as
it,
you can?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Although by then some of it may have been published, of course, at an earlier, but we then do remove it, yes.
Okay, thanks very much. That was great. And if you could take a seat up here at the panel, and we'll ask Sarah Chan to come forward from University of Edinburgh to talk about risks and benefits.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. So the first task of this commission is to identify the scientific issues that must be evaluated in relation to applications of human germline genome editing, and the social and ethical issues insofar as they are inextricably linked to research and clinical practice. Now, I would argue that I don't think there are any ethical and social issues that are not in some way inextricably linked to research and clinical practice when it comes to genome editing. But today I want to talk about three areas where the ethical, the social and the scientific particularly intersect: risk, rights and responsibility. And I want to suggest that there are some ways in which we should be thinking about these concepts, about these issues that we haven't thought about them in so far. So the first of these is in relation to the evaluation of risk. So this is the International Commission on Human Germline or Heritable Genome Editing. And in our discussions of the possibility of germline editing, there has been a tendency always to say, let's draw a bright line between the somatic and the germline. Let's put somatic in one box, and then when it comes to germline, we have to evaluate it in a different way. Now, we might argue about whether or not there is a moral bright line between them, but when it comes to assessing risks scientifically, I would argue that actually we need to consider these in tandem, so we cannot simply say, let's talk about somatic over here and then evaluate germline in a box over here. And there's a number of reasons for this. So the first is that when we are assessing risk in relation to a given technology, we're not asking what would make it safe. We're asking, when is it safe enough, in light both of the possible benefits of carrying out the technology, but also in comparison to the possible alternatives. So our evaluation of the risk-benefit balance of human germline genome editing has to take into account comparison with the alternatives, which might be do nothing, allow disease to happen, but it might also include choose somatic editing instead or choose PGT instead. And what we need to look at is which among those possible options offers the best balance of risks and benefits, all else being equal. It's not clear that heritable or germline versus somatic editing poses qualitatively different risks. So we might be tempted to say it does because heritable genome editing has the potential to affect the genes of the next generation, etc. But in fact, somatic editing can also affect the genes of the next generation, both at individual level by allowing people to survive and to reproduce who otherwise would not have done so. And if we start carrying it out on a sufficiently widespread basis, this will translate to having population-level genome effects. So in other words, if we make a choice to stick with a somatic rather than a heritable approach to genome editing, by saying let's treat this genetic disorder with somatic rather than germline therapy, we are effectively saying let's allow some mutations to be passed on or give them a high chance of being passed on that would otherwise not be passed on. Or we're constraining the reproductive options of the next generation. So we're saying if you want later to have children, you're going to have to go through the same sort of process if you want to have children who don't have disease, or they're going to have somatic therapy in their turn. I will also point out that we can't assume that people will always be in a position where they want to or can use techniques such as PGT, and I understand this was discussed yesterday. Perhaps one qualitative difference, if you like, that we might suggest between heritable genome editing and the risk of adverse effects is that the sorts of mutations we might be worried about passing on when it comes to heritable genome editing, so the off-target effects, etc., would be artificially created mutations rather than the naturally occurring ones of the genetic diseases that we're facing. But I think it's hard to see why this is necessarily a relevant difference. So all sorts of mutations do occur naturally. All sorts of naturally occurring mutations have very well characterized adverse effects. And in fact, at least at the individual level, I think it's hard to imagine anything that we might do accidentally that could be worse. The next point to note is that when we compare the risk, harm, cost versus benefits of the ratio between somatic germline editing and germline genome editing, it's not necessarily the case that germline or heritable genome editing always comes off worse. So although we've been quite happy to say up to now, yes, but it's too dangerous, yes, but it's too dangerous, again, in comparison to what? So let me lay this out for you. Somatic genome editing has the benefit that any side effects won't be passed on to future generations, but as I pointed out, it will still affect the genomes of future children in terms of who is born. You then need to potentially repeat it in each generation if you want to treat genetic disease, depending on what reproductive options are available. I will also note that we don't currently, to my understanding, we don't allow PGT, pre-implantation genetic testing, for carrier status only. It's only when the child would actually be affected by disease. So that's going to have an implication on what kinds of mutations do get passed on. We need also not to ignore that somatic gene therapy has costs and harms in and of itself. So there's both the cost to the patient, to the health system, of performing somatic genome therapy, but there's also the harm and suffering that patients undergo during the treatment procedure. So while they're waiting to be treated, consider, for example, the inherited anemias, which are seen as common targets for somatic gene therapy, to have to undergo bone marrow transplantation, to harvesting, to suffer the effects of the disease while you're waiting for the genetic modification and the in-culture expansion, and then to have to undergo the transplantation. These are not trivial procedures. So in other words, somatic treatment has costs and harms to the patient that we can't ignore. And then on top of that, repetition multiplies the risk. So this is what I call the how many times do you want to roll the dice problem. If you're going to say in every generation we're going to undertake a new procedure which has some degree of risks, those risks will multiply over generations. In contrast, heritable genome editing, yes, the side effects are potentially passed on, but again, that depends on the reproductive options available and the choices that are made. If it is successful, you don't need to repeat it, so you mitigate the costs and the multi-generational harms. And so this represents, if you like, a single instance of risk to a given individual. And the trade-off against those multi-generational instances of repeated risk plus the harms to the multiple subsequent generations who have to wait for their treatment will at some point mean that that trade-off becomes unfavorable in terms of doing somatic genome editing. At some point, it's actually going to be more favorable to do heritable genome editing. Now, of course, we need to consider, I'm not saying that's going to automatically make heritable genome editing better, but we do need to consider how we ought to distribute the risks involved with genome editing across both current and future generations. Is it right to put it all on one individual? Is it right to distribute it across future generations? And we need to ask what is actually at stake. So what are the risks, what are the harms we're concerned about for the first generation? So I'll come to that in a sec, but just to summarize what I'm saying about thinking about heritable and somatic genome editing together, we can't assume that heritable genome editing is automatically more dangerous and evaluate its risks separately. If we do that, we are conflating what I call moral risks with physical risks. We're taking the fact that germline editing involves different moral issues and saying, let's not think about the scientific, about the physical aspects together. So we need to incorporate a consideration of somatic genome editing as a possible alternative. And when we're making this comparison, we need to take into account both the distribution of risk and consider for each generation what's actually at stake, what are the harms. Okay, so when we talk about the rights of future generations, so we often talk quite generally when it comes to heritable genome editing about the rights of future generations. But who are these future generations and what sorts of rights are at stake? One problem when it comes to talking about heritable genome editing and reproductive choices is we're talking about future people who not only don't exist yet, but they also won't exist unless the genome editing procedure is carried out. Or to put it another way, if you don't do genome editing, they'll be different people. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in philosophical non-identity because I think that's a debate that has kind of no good solution right here. I do want to point out it's kind of hard to think about a right, the exercise of which would entail the right holder never having existed. So if, for example, you have a right not to have been born as a result of genome editing, what does that mean if that means actually you would not have existed? But of course, as I said, this is also a feature of somatic genome editing. So if we do or we don't carry out germline genome editing, if we do somatic instead of germline, that's going to make a difference as to which children come into existence in the future and which genes they have. And I think once we realise this, the question of what sorts of rights future generations should have over the genomes they're bequeathed actually becomes more problematic. So why should something like the right to an unmodified genome, I'll put aside the question of unmodified by what, because that's a question about who does it and whether that matters, but why should the right to an unmodified genome or the right not to have been born as the product of human genome editing necessarily take precedence over a right to a healthy genome or a right to be born free from disease? Or, in fact, the right not to be a congenital research subject. So it was great to hear Susan and Christine talk about follow-up studies over the long term, because I think one of the things we are concerned about is, are these children going to be perpetual research subjects? And I think the comparison with IVF research is particularly pertinent. Whenever I lecture about reproductive technologies, I always put up a picture of poor Louise Brown. Did she know? Did she consent to being a perpetual research subject? Not necessarily. Okay, so I also wonder, though, if what's at stake is not just about your own rights to have been born in a certain way, but a right about the children you might one day have. So is this about reproductive rights? Are we saying children might have a putative right to pass on an unmodified genome to their descendants, or perhaps to pass on a healthy genome? I want to digress very quickly to say, what are we worried about in terms of long-term follow-up and constraining reproductive choices? So when it comes to genome editing and reproductive rights, the question really is who bears the burden of mitigating the reproductive risks in relation to genetic disease and genome editing? And I'm going to suggest that this is actually both a scientific problem about the risks, but also an ethical problem about choices, the sorts of choices people should be able to make, and how those choices should be constrained or how we should be able to constrain them. So in heritable genome editing, if a heritable adverse event occurs, the editee would have a difficult reproductive choice over whether or not to have children and potentially to burden them with those effects. But of course, that's a similar choice that would-be parents already face if they have a genetic disease. They need to make the choice over whether or not to pass that on. And so I wonder why we are prioritizing the reproductive rights of future people over current people in terms of saying we want to give them maximal choice, so we're going to constrain your choices over whether or not to have children in a certain way. And again, as I pointed out, if we used somatic genome editing instead, then the child who was born in the first generation would still carry that disease, would then face choices over what to pass on. So what are we worried about in terms of people signing up to research and their choices being constrained? What would happen if we had, if you like, an accidental escape of a genetically modified human? And I want to use this to suggest that actually we should be more aware of the ways in which the discourse over genetic modification in general, and particularly GMOs, is perhaps shaping our thinking around what we worry about, what are our worst fears when it comes to human heritable genetic modification. If one child or two child or even 10 children were to refuse to be followed up or to refuse to have their reproductive choices constrained in light of potential negative effects, what would actually be the consequences of that? And I'm going to come to that in a moment. I might skip over this global dimensions part just because of time. So what are we afraid of? What are we scared of in terms of what might happen? We're scared of the long-term effects, the things that we don't know about yet. The rights of future generations have been discussed particularly with respect to environmental policy, and out of this environmental discussion has come what we call the precautionary principle. Now, often these days we tend to think of the precautionary principle as saying, well, if we don't know what's going to happen, so it's how to react in terms of uncertainty. If we don't know what's going to happen, we shouldn't do anything. But if you look at the original sorts of formulations, that's not how the precautionary principle was cast. So the Rio Declaration actually says when we're not sure what's going to happen, we shouldn't use our lack of knowledge as a reason not to take a cost-effective measure to mitigate harm. So actually there's a more proactionary formulation inherent in that. When we think about the precautionary principle as used against heritable genome editing, there are kind of two claims in terms of we're not sure what will happen, so we shouldn't do it. One's empirical, about the balance of risk and what we ought to do, and it assumes that, well, we're more likely to mess something up than not. And again, I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, because it's not just mess something up, it's better or worse than what. And in the case of better than or worse than serious disease, again, what could we mess up that would be worse than the diseases with which people are now faced? And there's a moral element about for which consequences we should be held responsible. So if we do something and we mess it up, are we more responsible than if we don't do something and things mess up on their own? So there's a kind of, by analogy, responsibility of nature argument that if we're more responsible for causing versus allowing things to happen, we're more responsible for acts versus omissions. But I think this conflates causal and moral responsibility. Okay, so let's get to the point. What's the worst that could happen? What is this uncertainty? What's going to happen if we have an accidental escape of a human genetically modified organism? Now, I was thinking about this, and I guess our worst case scenario is that there's some kind of unknown or unpredictable effect that we don't recognize to begin with. It's maybe indefinitely delayed, and it spreads through the entire population. We only realize when it's too late, and then some kind of genetic time bomb goes off and destroys the entire human species. How likely is this to happen in actuality? So this is, again, where thinking about the discourse over genetically modified organisms and the kind of things we've worried about there, and whether or not they're realistic to worry about in terms of human genetic modification, I think is instructive. So, humans are not mosquitoes. Humans are not crop plants. We don't breed like they do. We don't reproduce like they do. And we're also political subjects. So these worries about, well, wild populations could be contaminated, it could spread, etc. I don't know that that's realistic in terms of what's likely to happen in human populations. I'm trying to think of what mechanisms we could envision. So how likely is this actually to happen? How likely is it that we wouldn't become aware of this problem and be able to address it before the genetic time bomb had spread throughout the whole human race? How likely is it that in the time this would take to happen, we wouldn't already have been wiped out by anthropogenic climate disaster? And I will point out, this is something that the Nuffield Council raised, in terms of thinking about genotype plus environment equaling phenotype, we're already full of natural genetic time bombs in terms of our inability to survive the likely environmental catastrophes that are coming. And the Nuffield Council actually suggested maybe we should be using or looking at using heritable genome editing to address this. But so I want to close by saying, I speculated about this and I couldn't think of what mechanisms there would be for the worst case or how likely it would be. But there are ways of thinking about this. We understand a lot about genetics. Let's try and foresee. I've said, do we need Cassandra science? Let's actually try and foresee the worst case, try and understand how it might happen in order to understand what the worst case is, and so hopefully not be so afraid of it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes, and
shall I come?
Well, let's see if there's specific questions for you first, and I'm sure. Yes. So,
Thank you for an excellent presentation. The language of rights, there's the sort of ordinary language, and then there's the legal human rights language. And as you rightly pointed out, there is no right not to be modified. There's no right to be born free from disease. There's no right, often attributed to children, to have an open future. That human right does not exist. But children do have a right under the International Convention on the Rights of the Child to the highest attainable state of health possible. And if you look at Article 24, it includes prenatal and interventions and care. So that's has yet to be interpreted what that means. There's also a right to be free from malpractice. So whereas there is no right not to be born, and we had all those wrongful life cases in the 1990s, there is such a thing as genetic malpractice, so we have to keep that in mind. What I find most interesting, and this is the first question, is the possibility of adapting the 1997 rights of future generations, largely used for the environment till now, as a tool to frame the future, and how could we do with this in this very sensitive domain? And my second question is, the UK and France are both unique in having laws that, or well, in France it was case law, and here it was a law called the Congenital Disability Civil Liability Act, where children cannot sue their mother in the UK and their parents in France for having been born with a condition where the parents deliberately choose or negligently do something during pregnancy. So do you think we need to have for the future that kind of legal protection for reproductive choice? That's my second question. My first is, can we adapt the rights of future generations to include the right to benefit from science and its advances?
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to take that first point about rights as a comment, and it's an excellent one. You're right, I was a little bit philosophically sloppy with my use of rights language, and I didn't engage with the human rights aspect. But actually, I think when it comes to an analysis, and I will leave that to those who are the experts in human rights, it's actually far more likely that we're going to find human rights justifications to use this technology rather than to refrain from it. As far as do we need legislation to protect people around this, I think one of the worries is that we are concerned about the extent to which, as I said, it's justifiable, it's allowable to constrain reproductive choices, and I suppose if we have protective legislation that, in a sense, helps to maintain those reproductive freedoms with which we're concerned, then that might be a good thing. Yeah, thank you. Two really great points.
So specific questions for Sarah before we start the panel discussion. Looks like we have a few. We have three there, so let's try to go quickly so we can get into the panel.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. It's just a brief comment, which is that basically I haven't seen a better collection of straw people put up to be knocked down in a long time. So thanks for the entertainment. But really, I just suggest to the Commission that if it wants a serious discussion of what the scientific risks are and of the ethics, that it might actually like to, invite some of the biologists and ethicists who have, actually done serious work on what those risks are and what the ethics of taking those risks are, rather than someone who starts from the position that these risks are really not worth considering.
I think that exactly points to that exactly highlights my point about not conflating moral and physical risks. I don't think it needs further response than that.
Okay, next.
I would like to say the following to your comparisons. You compare somatic and inheritable gene therapy. But I think in terms of the goal at the end when you go into inheritable should be the comparison with the present option that you have, which is the pre-implantation diagnosis and choice, because you end up at the same thing. You eliminate the mutation. And with the present situation where we are still very unsure about what are the risks, I think it would be too early to say this is a permissible strategy. I think we should hold back. I think the only event that could change that, if we come to the Nuffield comparison and conclusion, we need it for something that we can't do otherwise, which means, in effect, a beneficial change of the genome. And concerning the risks, if we don't have a proper legislation, we open the door to all kind of fraud and things that have been discussed yesterday I don't want to go into, unscientific claims and money.
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree with you that we need proper regulation. I don't think that's in question at all by hopefully anyone in this room. I also agree that PGT is probably a better and more credible alternative in a lot of cases. But the point that I was trying to make was that we have also, in many ways, hived off the discussion of heritable from somatic, and my argument is not they are the only two alternatives, but that we need to be considering them more seriously as alternatives.
Well, all right, last comment before we go to the panel.
So, with some trepidation, I want to tackle your issue of non-existence of a person, because it is the fundamental difference between PGD and genome editing. In PGD, it is a different child that exists. So in other words, if you went with natural conception, there's a likelihood that one of the children who's affected might exist. What you're doing is preventing, if you like, preventing someone, but it is a different child. When you do genome editing, if it were a one-to-one relationship, it is the same child that exists, but in a slightly different format, because you've altered something. We heard yesterday about what might be the presence, what you might be if you had or had not an abnormality. And the second thing is that when we're talking about germline genome editing, it is important to appreciate that you're trying to speculate what the effects of the children later in life, in other words, as adults. And we mustn't try and predict what genome technology is going to be like in 25 years' time. We couldn't have predicted this 5 years ago.
Thank you. So I actually very much do not want to contend too much with the problem of non-existence, because I think the philosophical subtleties are not that relevant to the public ethical discourse. I will say that whether or not you think, so that's the conventional received view, is PGT is choosing different children, genome editing is making a change to a given child. That does depend on your account of identity, so that's not actually fully settled. But the other thing is, even if that's the case in the first generation, the identity of the children in subsequent generations is equally variable depending on what's chosen. Does that make sense? And then sorry, what was your second point? Oh, about genome technology. Yeah, actually, I think that is something that we do need to also turn back to the scientific panel to say, given our uncertainty about where the technology might be and what might be possible, we can't only say what might be the negative effects in the future, but also to what extent will we have developed new tools that are better able to address this? How much do we hold off waiting for the next best thing to come? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really a fascinating discussion. Have a seat, and while you're sitting, I'll just break the ice here. Reminds me, I was nominated to be FDA commissioner, and I met with a senator from Alaska, where genetically engineered salmon, was a top issue for Alaska. And I had been briefed that it was under discussion, but they forgot to tell me that the animal branch of the FDA was going to approve genetically engineered salmon 3 days later. So it happened, and my nomination was put on hold, and it took a couple of months to take care of that issue. We did it by renaming a different fish to get rid of another problem that Alaska had. But this question of what happens if one genetically engineered member of a species gets out on the loose, it's really an interesting thing to think about, but anyway, we won't get into that discussion too much, but there are real consequences of these sorts of things in the political world that we live in. All right, so Sarah, did you
well, I think that's a great point. How likely is it that, given the ways in which humans reproduce and interact socially, could an accidental escape human cause the kind of population level effects that we're thinking about in mosquitoes or salmon or crops? And my point was, I think it doesn't make sense really to talk about humans in that way. We are not crops or mosquitoes, and that there are political dimensions, for example, public health justifications that might come in for saying, actually, we're going to restrict certain freedoms, so quarantine would be a perfect example. If there were really a big enough public health threat, there might be justifications to.
Yeah, so that, I mean, I just to remind everyone, the remit of this group is not to decide whether it should be done. It's what would the procedures be to estimate risks and benefits, and is there a translational pathway if it were going to be attempted. So I think this is a very relevant part of the discussion, is really assessing what the risks are quantitatively.
Wrong as well. A procedure for handling adverse events has got to be part of that.
So, could I ask in the back? Sorry. So I wondered if you could, perhaps this is a question for Sarah or others, if you could speak to if in terms of, you know, if the desired outcome for both PGD and genome editing or other approaches is to produce a healthy, disease-free child. The question I had is whether one should regulate the outcome of a procedure or the tools that achieve that final outcome. Obviously in GM crops, this has had major repercussions. So it would be really useful. And then I guess it speaks to Peter's question, which is one can't predict the next tool potentially that, you know, that could be developed. So.
I think that's a really great question. I will slightly nuance what you've said, that a desired outcome is not just a healthy child, but a healthy genetically related child. I think that's important to note. As far as tools versus outcomes, so when it comes to GM crops, I very much think we should be looking at outcomes. I'm trying to think why I feel this is slightly disanalogous, and I think it has to do with the ways in which it affects the reproductive choices that are available. So in fact, what we're regulating here is not, so again, we're not crops, we're not actually just regulating tools, technologies, and products. We are saying things about the ways in which human behavior, human action can or should be controlled. And to me, I think that makes something different about this, but I'll have to think more on it. Thank you.
But we have other comments. I just want to reserve time near the close for all three of you to comment on this question of the right not to be a research subject, which seemed to come up. And of course, I come from a viewpoint that everyone should be participate in research because it's the only way we understand what to do about ourselves. But we'll need to discuss that. I know there are a bunch of yes.
It came up yesterday and again today, this question of dysgenics, the fact of affecting the gene pool over time. If you look at diabetes, which has been treated for the last number of decades, and now diabetics, who would have been naturally selected out, are reproducing. We have PKU screen babies who are now having PKU children. So we've been interfering with the gene pool for quite some time. So when we talk about the rights of future generations, we are already selecting in and selecting out through prenatal, pre-GT, and so there's no novelty in that sense. It's just that some of our choices are already collectively represented in our healthcare systems and screening. So is there this right of future generations? Could it include the access to, in societies that have the means, to programs to optimize future outcomes? Would children have such a right?
All three of you should comment on this. This is a really good question.
So this is, without wanting to say for sure we do or don't have a right, but this is why I put up alternative rights, including to a life free from disease or a healthy genome, as, you know, I think these should be at least equally important. I think what might lie behind our idea that, well, you don't have a right to be free from diabetes or whatever, even though we're inadvertently selecting those in, but you do have a right to be free from off-target effects introduced by genome editing, comes down to that idea that what happens in nature is less of our responsibility, whereas something we've done, we're more responsible for. I didn't have time to go into the detailed argument, but I don't think that's a justified approach to responsibility.
As a lifelong doctor, let me just say that's an interesting discussion, but
well, legally I know it's different, but morally I think there's a lot less to choose between them.
Comments from the panel?
Well, it's slightly a tangential answer, but I do think one thing that's very important in all of this is to listen to what children tell us. Certainly in this whole field of research, there have been a lot of assumptions made about what children will feel and think. And it's only really by waiting for them to get old enough to tell us that we get some idea, and often that's completely contradicts what we thought they were going to think. So I just think going forward, it's important to speak to children and teenagers and so on about their views and their futures.
I could just say that I think it's we as professionals and researchers to take this responsibility. We can't put it on the parents because they will take any risks. They will pay anything to get a child, and they will really take any medical risks. Even if they get a diseased child, that's much better than no child. So I really think that it's our responsibility to have this discussion, not rely on the parents.
Comment over here.
I think, Sarah, I agree with you that we shouldn't dwell too long on non-identity as a conversation that's had between philosophers, but we can talk about, for instance, the differences between PGD and genome editing, as Peter was saying. So a question for Susan, actually. You talked about the kind of conversations that children born might want to have about what happened to me as an embryo. And so I'm asking the panel to think out loud about how that conversation might go if we were to compare a child born following PGD and a child following genome editing followed by PGD. Remembering there's a complication to Peter's question, which is at the moment we would have to perform genome editing before knowing whether the embryo carried the mutation. Therefore, it wouldn't necessarily be clear whether or not the child born had the mutation in the first place or was actually, in fact, not carrying the mutation. So that's a slight wrinkle. But nevertheless, how would you talk to those children? And what do you think the significant differences might be between those two approaches?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it has to be a speculative answer, obviously. I mean, from what we know from children, let's say take children born through surrogacy. I mean, there was a great deal of consternation about surrogacy 20, 30 years ago, and everybody assumed that children would be very upset about being born to another woman who relinquished them to the intended parents, if that woman was their genetic mother, if they'd been paid, and so on. So lots of conditions that you would make you think that these children would be very upset about what had happened to them. And in fact, what we learn from speaking to these children is that A, they're not. They're usually quite neutral about it. Some see it as something special and positive about them. Occasionally you get a tiny minority of those who are unhappy, as you'd expect. You always get variation. But I think the reason that these children are accepting of their slightly unusual way of being born is that they have very good relationships with their parents. And their parents have, because you can't hide surrogacy, their parents have always spoken to them about how they came to be. Often they've grown up knowing their surrogate and so on. Now, I know it's a very different situation, but I think what we can draw from it is that if children are spoken to, if their anxieties are listened to and so on, then, and their parents are, provide a loving family environment, I think these children will be accepting of whatever decision their parents made. As I say, this is very speculative, if they feel that their parents did it in their best possible interests. In terms of distinction between PGD and germline editing, I think only if children end up having physical or medical problems or psychological or social problems as a result of editing, would that be any different? And for children, a big issue is stigmatization. So if it turns out that these children are in some way stigmatized for being different, which seems to me quite unlikely because IVF children weren't, but if in some way they do appear to be different to the outside world, I think that's what would be problematic for children. But again, it's
To the chairs, can we go 5 minutes over? All right, I'm keeping a close watch here. So I know we have a number of questions, so we'll just have to take them in order, going left to right, I guess. You want to go to the back? Okay.
Hi, Hilary Sutcliffe from Society Inside, an NGO looking at responsible use of tech. I'm looking at doing a project at the moment on trust in the governance of tech. So not the tech itself, but how can we trust the governance of the tech, and the conversation we're having today. There's so many trust issues come up. I just wanted to ask you, and looking at Susan and Sarah as well, particularly, a lot of our findings are that human social values haven't been incorporated and considered in part of governance is a big source of distrust. And we see this happening here today. On the one hand, I think society will be astonished and excited that we're discussing the minutiae of these things and how are they incorporated into the final governance. But the other hand, our findings are that we're so focused on the science and the theory, we don't listen to actually people and how they can actually contribute to that debate. And I wondered if you had any views on how society can contribute to the design of governance, in that it can be therefore more trustworthy and more trusted as part of that process, including obviously people who think very wildly different about the process of governance as well as the outcomes. Long question, sorry.
Well, that's a simple question.
So the question of how can publics participate in the responsible governance of science is actually the subject of a project that we are hoping to launch quite soon. So I agree it's really important, and I think historically it has been the case that publics have not been given the chance sufficiently to engage with the governance of technology, and that's led to various problems. I think the times are changing. I think the fact that every declaration has said we need to involve publics in this discourse, we need the social engagement, and then there's the question about what is that and how do we do that in a responsible way. So I think that indicates there is a will to try and incorporate that, even if questions over how we do it. I will point out, though, that I was really interested when we had the Royal Society's public dialogue on genetic technologies. One of the striking findings for me is that germline genome editing is not such a big, not such a big bugbear as we had once thought it was. And I think this was reflected in the public response to the announcement about the genome-edited twins last year. It wasn't the end of the world. So people are not seeing germline editing as this, we must never cross this Rubicon. They're much more able to think about what are the benefits, will this help me or people I know, what are the possible risks. So I think we are learning from publics in that way.
Any other comments? This is obviously a big issue for tech and science, which I'm hyper aware of right now.
I think the only thing is that I think certainly social science researchers in this field are involving relevant members of the public in designing the research and carrying out the research. Certainly we're moving in that direction, and other groups are too.
And it seems like we agree it's needed, but how to do it is, so I'm glad there are projects that are underway to work on it.
Understand how to do it. Yeah.
Okay, over here to the left.
Yes, hi. I guess I have a comment, and I would invite any of you to respond, and perhaps even members of the International Commission. Today and yesterday, we've heard a lot about the rights of children. We've heard about reproductive rights. We've heard about the rights of future generations. And I'm wondering why we aren't hearing the converse of that, which has more to do with responsibilities. And there was a hint of that in a remark earlier. But if I think about the rights of future generations, it's much easier for me to turn the question around and say, what responsibilities do we have to future generations? We might listen to our Indigenous peoples who talk to us about the 7-generation rule. So what is it to exercise the moral imagination and to think about what obligations we have today in terms of choices we make that will have an impact on 7 generations hence? I also think the same with respect to claims about the rights of children. To me, having children is about a responsibility, hopefully one that one takes on willingly, but having children is a responsibility, and so I'm interested in what are the responsibilities we think we have. And also, I haven't heard yet anything about the responsibilities to the women research participants, and that many of you will know is something that I care about deeply, and I know that there's expertise here. And so I'm interested in anybody who wants to tell me a little bit more about what responsibilities we have.
You have to have a short answer and maybe longer discussion at the break.
Françoise, I think that's a really great point. The reason I didn't mention the gendered aspects of the technology and the burdens it's going to place on women was just I ran out of time. I have a big asterisk thing saying talk about gendered aspects of time. But I think actually that point that both the choices that we make will have more implications for women within whose bodies reproduction takes place and whose eggs have to be harvested, etc. And particularly those who are the first the first to, I guess, gestate genetically genome-edited children. And I always think about the fact that in the early IVF experiments, I think the women were made to sign over rights over their bodies to say, you know, if you advise me if something goes wrong, I'm going to agree to have a termination. And that to me is highly problematic.
Okay, so it sounds like that'll be a good topic for the break. Last comment, and then I know there's some caffeine deficient people in the audience.
Thank you very much. Well, I won't keep you from your caffeine for too long. It seemed to me that there was an important finding in Susan's presentation that in the population that she'd studied, the finding was that genetic relatedness was less important than openness about the circumstances of conception. And insofar as that's the case, I'd like to use that to try to sort of open up Sarah's presentation a little bit beyond the rather narrow framing around speculative harms and benefits of prospective technologies. And this has given a huge impetus, I think, by Christina's last comment on the panel, which was about the extent to which families, prospective parents, will go in order to satisfy their reproductive preferences. And the comment is this, that if genetic relatedness is the essential thing in motivating the availability, the use of genome editing technologies, because they're obviously, to satisfy any other preferences, there are alternative means of doing so, then are we failing adequately to consider the value placed on reproductive freedoms, reproductive liberties, or are we simply assuming that people have the right in some way to exercise reproductive preferences in order to access these technologies? And just while I have the floor, I'd like very quickly to correct an insidious misrepresentation of the Nuffield Council report, with which I was involved, that the Nuffield Council believes that genome editing for a range of non-personally beneficial applications is authorised. The point was really more that it is the context and the circumstances in which genome editing is applied that have more relevance than the clinical ontology of particular conditions that it might seek to avoid. That was just simply a sort of example of trying to envisage those kinds of circumstance. Thank you.
Okay, well, perhaps I'll start. If I could answer that, not so much in terms of rights, but I do think you've raised a really interesting question about the importance or not of genetic relatedness with children. And yesterday, Annelien Brodenow brought this issue up as well in her presentation. I think that people have this idea, and it's true in most cases, that the first choice for people or for couples is to have a genetically related child. But this isn't something that's necessarily fixed. And many people try and fail to have a genetically related child. And then, as through time and through changes in circumstance, then begin to feel differently about having a non-genetically related child, either through donor conception or through adoption. And for many people, this results in having a very happy, functioning, satisfying family life. Now, it's not for everybody. For some people, it is very, very important. But I think there's often this idea that this is something that's very fixed because people, certainly in the first instance, prefer to have a genetically related child. But I think we often forget that this can change over time.
I guess the often unwritten benefit to be weighed in the balance there when we think about the risks and benefit is the benefit of allowing people the choice to have a genetically related child, and that I don't think should be an absolute. It's not a trump. It ought to be weighed along with everything else. I think maybe this allows me as well to respond a bit more to the point about responsibilities. Do parents have a responsibility to make the kinds of choices about their reproduction, which might include saying, I won't have a genetically related child, or perhaps I won't have children at all? And I think we've been a little reluctant in the past to juxtapose talk of reproductive rights with reproductive responsibilities, particularly when it comes to the responsibility to not pass your genes on, precisely because that discourse has been used so much in the past to marginalise and take away the rights of people who are already disadvantaged. But more and more people today do talk about, I choose not to have children because I think it's the responsible thing for the planet, etc. So I think we're shifting to a new era of discourse.
I think that's a great comment to end and either go to the bar or to the coffee shop, depending on how you feel about all this. Thank you very much for a fascinating panel.
I really do. Nice to meet you.
Start at 22. It's gone. Can we restart at 22, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. If we could begin in the interests of time. Right, in this session, we're hoping to build on the discussions of yesterday and earlier this morning and start to discuss the key questions and elements that we'll need to address in order to construct a potential translational pathway for human germline editing. And the speakers are going to introduce themselves because they come from a variety of different backgrounds as they present their 10-minute comment. What we've done is give them some questions before they turned up today, and what I'm going to do in the next series of slides is tell you what those key issues were. Any of the information in this session, of course, doesn't represent conclusions of the recommendations of the Commission, so this is a free discussion. And this long list, what is the intended clinical purpose of human genome germline editing, are meant to help us frame how we might construct this potential translational pathway. Do alternative clinical approaches exist? We discussed some of those yesterday. What specific genome editors would be required? What is the expected frequency of different types of off-target edits? That's the science, and we had, again, a large session on that yesterday. Is there evidence whether the desired genome edits could have potentially undesirable phenotypic consequences, both for the individual and the descendants with the edit? Have the editing and delivery technologies been extensively tested? And of course, there are societal questions. What are the potential non-clinical implications of the proposed use? What other factors such as cost, access and healthcare disparities that should be considered when we're talking about the desirability of pursuing this particular use? The initial taxonomy of potential uses, monogenic diseases that with life-threatening or severe health consequences, those that increase the risk of serious disease, those that affect the quality of life, polygenic variation, genetic variation affecting non-disease traits, and novel genetic changes. So the key considerations are, for example, the nature of those genome edits. Is it proposed to edit aiming to change a rare variant to a sequence that's commonly carried in the population? We have to consider, and we did some of this yesterday, the possibility of PGD as an option to conceive unaffected children. We have to think about penetrance, and we have to think of the existence of an effective prevention or treatment for the diseases for which we are thinking about germline editing. So there will be a decision point for which potential use categories might be possible at the present time to develop a responsible clinical translational path. The next stage really is the framework for developing that responsible translational path. And this is why we've got such a lot of different expertise across the panel. We need legal approval for the proposed use, perhaps adherence to normative practice guidelines, standard and policy. We'll need institutional review and approval. We need assessment and approval by appropriate national regulatory bodies and potentially international regulatory bodies. We need adherence to relevant outcome reporting, and we had some discussion of that in the last session. And we need adherence to relevant mechanisms for this international coordination so that what we propose is realistic. And we need to make sure that we can adapt to the science as it goes forward. We don't come out with something that is going to be suitable for today, but out of date in 2 or 3 years' time. So for you, are these questions the right ones? Does the draft taxonomy sufficiently capture the typical types of usage and the potential? What are the most relevant key considerations for the different types of uses? What else needs to be captured as part of the core elements of a responsible translational pathway? And how should a decision on potential application of human germline editing be made? Now, each of the panelists is going to give 10 minutes, and then we'll open it to the floor. And each one of you, I think, if you could just introduce your expertise so that the audience can appreciate where your perspective is grounded. And the first person is Peter.
Okay. I'm Peter Brodie. I've worked in assisted reproduction for more than 45 years. I have been involved from the beginning of IVF all through ICSI, PGD, PGT, the whole business, and including MRT, and I sat on the HFEA panels discussing that. Now, I had a really very bad night. My fellow speakers and audience turned my head into a washing machine, and some of you had the audacity to turn it on to fast spin. I hadn't intended to produce any slides, but I looked at one of those issues there was about the draft taxonomy, about whose genome editing going to be useful for me. And I've got some slides. If you can pass me the little changer, that'll be quite helpful. So I looked at this issue of developing a pathway. And I've taken a whole lot of things, but what I've been trying to work out is where are the difficulties? And I think we've got to deal with scientific imperative and the limits of control, and the demand for unmet need, which we will see papers about, but that is either real or imagined, and I think it's the latter usually, and I spoke about this yesterday with PGD as an alternative to this. And I think there's poorly understood science, and there's greed from practitioners, and sometimes money, and sometimes fame, and something both. Now, I notice you have a difficult task. You have no reproductive clinicians on your commission, although I think Doug and Andy will have a good job, but this is where it is going to impact. You've got good scientists, you've got people who understand it and are trying to make changes. Let me, this will change it downwards, it says, let me introduce you to my granddaughter, Clara. See, it's the grandfather day today, Doug. She turns 2 today, and this is my honest apology to her for not being at her birthday party, because I said I would be here, and I am. But I'll tell you what's going to happen there. Is my daughter-in-law, Donna, she will be getting, I know, some colouring paints and brushes and so on, and she will put Clara into a waterproof apron, and she will put on a waterproof apron, and she will put a waterproof cloth on the table, and this will all happen in the kitchen, which has a ceramic floor. It's a nice house. And then Clara will get the paints, and she's got a little book to colour, and she'll start out by colouring them, trying to get it between the lines. And then she'll go off the lines. And then she'll go anywhere on the page. And then she'll start colouring the cloth, and then she'll colour her hands, and she'll have a go at Donna, and eventually will spill something on the floor. And that is the problem of putting regulation in and hoping that it's going to do what you expect it to do, because it usually doesn't. This is when we actually talk about assisted reproduction technology, and I said some people don't understand the science. This has been classic in the issue of MRT, and I've picked MRT because it is transgenerational. It is what we're going to be talking about. And as you know, this was developed for people with serious genetic disease. It was churned over. We had 5 reports on it. And eventually we had legislation which lays down exactly, this is the UK, what can be done, and I know Doug and his unit are struggling to get their pregnancy, may have, doesn't tell me, in Newcastle. But before any of that happened, what we had is somebody using it for one case of MRT in a way we heard about yesterday that avoided the legislation, because it was done in America, then done in Mexico, and so on and so forth. And then we get reports about it used not for genetic disease, but for infertility. So this wasn't predicted at the time, although in the UK legislation, it is specifically says it can't be used for that. Why are people going down the line of trying to use MRT for infertility? And I need to take you a few slides just to explain the logic. It starts off back in 1998, I think it was 1988, with Jacques Cohen doing cytoplasmic injection. And what he did at the time of ICSI, for patients whose embryos tended not to cleave, is he injected a little bit of cytoplasm from a donor. You can see it showing up there as red. A small amount. And what happened is he did a number of patients, and lo and behold, they get pregnant. He often had to put an awful lot of embryos back. As you can see, I've got 6, he got twins, all sorts of things. But he got babies out. Well, once you say that to reproductive clinicians who have patients who can't get pregnant, they think this is the miracle. Why did he do it in the first place? Well, this goes back even further to our laboratories in the early 1980s, when Hester Pratt and Martin Goddard and Audrey Muggleton Harris were looking at early mouse embryos. And just to explain to you what is going on, you have strains of mice which develop perfectly normally in vivo. Okay? There's a strain called C. If you take them and put them in culture, they do what H and I show you, is they don't develop. They stop at the 2-cell stage if you put them in culture. But they develop normally in the mouse, and you have other strains there on the right, which if you put in culture, develop quite normally. And Audrey wondered, is there something odd about the cytoplasm? Because you can see there's some clumping of the mitochondria. And the experiment that she did was to inject some cytoplasm from the non-blocking strain into the blocking strain, and lo and behold, you can see it goes through to the 4-cell stage in vitro. So there was something in the some factor you could go round. When Jacques did his study, he was very clear about what was going in. He did not say, I am putting mitochondria in. He said, it's some of the stuff that's there, but there's inherited messages, there are ribosomes, proteins, spindle organizing units, a whole lot of stuff that could be going in fact. And it was criticized as being a genetic technique, which it was not intended to be. And in fact, through the FDA, eventually they decided they shouldn't go ahead without further discussion and application, and it was stopped. That doesn't stop the world. You can go to all sorts of places, and you can have cytoplasmic injection, despite the fact that there is no rationale whatsoever to have this procedure done. We don't understand it. And more importantly now, they said, well, if it was mitochondria, why not change all the mitochondria? So now you take the technology of MRT, which you've carefully regulated, and you start using it for infertility, which is very surprising because it was never developed for that, and there isn't any rationale to keep it going. And there are risks which we know about. This slide was shown to you yesterday by Catherine. It was at the ESHRA meeting. It was sent to me. I didn't take the slide. But what I want to point out to you is, firstly, this was done in Ukraine, and they've done it over a number of patients, and there are no pregnancies. So it doesn't work, even they admit it. But they tried all sorts of things. They even tried things that have never been tried in humans before. Polar body transfer. Okay? We sat about that, and we didn't even discuss it because it was too controversial at the time, and it had never been tried. They tried it on infertile patients because they felt their need was great enough. They tried germinal vesicle transfer to see if that worked. So they tried anything because it had something to do with mitochondria in their view. And that is the problem. People don't understand the science, and they apply what you are trying to regulate in an unregulated way. Well, the question is, what will people stick to? If they won't stick to what is being done in that, what will they stick to? Well, in this country, we have the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act. It's now quite old, 1990, it's been modified a few times. But what is quite clear in there is it's stated what you may and may not do. And in our country, you cannot do research for more than 14 days, and you cannot take an embryo beyond that. We're allowed to do that, but in other places of the world, you're not even allowed to do that. What is interesting is when you look at this paper, which I can't remember who spoke about it yesterday, Kathy mentioned. When you start looking at embryos being grown in vitro in a structured environment to see could you replicate from embryonic stem cells, how far could you get, how far can you get with embryos. This work, which was done particularly by Magda Zernicke-Gertz in Cambridge, produced beautiful embryos, but they stopped them at 13 days, because that's what the law says in this country. But it was also done in the States, where you don't have regulation. And when did they stop? At 13 days. So here we've got a whole package in this country that says this, and you've got countries without regulation, but for some reason people think this is a good idea. We are not going to go any further. There's discussion in this country about pushing the boundary, but it depends how you get the message across. The Commission can do what they like. I don't envy them at all. People will go around it. They will find a way of doing it, and they will do surprising things that you never considered. My honest opinion in all of this is, ask the question, why do we actually need germline editing? Okay, and what is the goal? Somebody, I think it was Melissa who mentioned that yesterday. How does the Commission provide advice when there's already so many different ways of doing this? For example, you can do embryo research in this country, but in other EU countries you can't. You certainly can't create an embryo for research, which we can. It is variable everywhere, and there's a law in this country that allows us to do certain things. And the other question I need to ask is, if we're really concerned about germline editing, why is ART unregulated in so many countries, for example, America? Because you're doing things, and we heard from Christina, we don't know what these effects are. We don't know, we heard from Azim yesterday about epigenetic effects. Why is this allowed to run unregulated, but you want to regulate germline genome editing when the germline is highly likely to be altered epigenetically by all the manipulations that are done in ART? As Melissa said yesterday, you have to look at what is doable now, you have to look at what is practical, and above all, do what is honest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can now invite Richard to make some comments, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Richard Ashcroft. I am now Deputy Dean of the Law School at City University of London. Until the beginning of September, I was a Professor of Bioethics at Queen Mary University of London. Now I am an humble administrator concerned only with managing humans to make them happy. Before that I was some kind of intellectual, I suppose, but trained in philosophy and worked in bioethics for about 25 years now. So I want to use the privilege you've very kindly given me of sitting on this panel to be difficult. There are two kinds of bioethicists, the helpful kind and the difficult kind. And in the ordinary way, I'm the helpful kind, but sometimes it's useful to have the difficult kind. So that's what I'm going to do. And I want to focus specifically on the quote-unquote selected societal questions and the quote-unquote overarching question. And just to refresh your memory, the selected societal questions are: what are the potential non-clinical implications of the proposed use, including social, ethical, cultural and societal issues that should be evaluated through appropriate processes? And secondly, what other factors such as cost, access and healthcare disparities should be considered in evaluating the desirability of pursuing the intended use? Now, if you've been around the field of bioethics as long as I have, and some of you have been around considerably longer, you will have come across the expression ELSI, which stands for ethical, legal and social implications of. It was originally genetics, and then it expanded to include neurosciences, and now, of course, genome editing and other artificial intelligence is the hip subject du jour. And that's where I was yesterday and where I'll be this afternoon, is thinking about AI. The very distinguished social scientist Nicholas Rose pointed out more than 20 years ago that this is a deeply problematic expression to use. And it's deeply problematic because it assumes something like technological determinism. It assumes that there are scientific and technological changes and these have implications. Now, in one sense, it's a handy way to model how we might think about society, and it's especially a convenient way to model it if you don't spend much of your time thinking about society. If what your main concern is how mitochondria work, then you probably want to keep a simple model of society as something that happens outside your laboratory and which your work has implications for it. However, it's not a good model of how society works, and it's a concern to me that the Commission is distinguished as it is with very eminent people on it from the sciences and medicine and indeed ethics and the law. There is no contribution from the humanities, there is no contribution from history in particular, not even history of science and medicine. There is no contribution from sociology or political science. And that means, I think, that you start off with one hand right behind your back when thinking about the social context and the social influence, the social construction of genome editing. So when thinking about potential implications, I would ask you to pause and consider what's your model of social causation, what's your model of how technology is embedded in society and how technological change and social change are related to each other. I suspect it's complex, it's multi-directional, and it's certainly not as simple as I invent something and then you apply it and then society decides whether it likes it. A second set of challenges is around this question about healthcare disparities, cost, access, and so on. It often comes up in ethical debates about some new technology that we talk and talk and talk about harm and risk, and when we talk and talk and talk about autonomy, and then somebody says, ah, yes, and what about justice? Now, one of the problems with that is that the justice comes in as an afterthought, and another is that there is little in the way of consensus within philosophy or economics or public life about what we mean by justice. And one off-the-shelf version is John Rawls's account in his A Theory of Justice, which is, of course, extremely distinguished. But it's not a model of justice that fits in very well to how we might think about regulation of technologies. Most innovators would be very averse to the idea that you should build justice into a regulatory system. If you have an interesting product and somebody says, well, it's all very well and its risk-benefit profile is good, but we're not licensing it because we think it will produce social inequality, you will go directly to your lawyer and directly to your senator or MP to say, what is this nonsense? This is no way to approach innovation. So it's a problematic approach to thinking about regulation, both from the point of view of can we agree what we mean by justice, and also how it would fit into regulation, or decisions about where to invest R&D spend even. And yet we should still be having the conversation. The question is, where does that conversation take place? Who is having it? Who is party to it? In what language? And that's where I have to mention my own déformation professionnelle, which is that I'm trained as a philosopher, or more accurately, history and philosophy of science. And of course, what I would give you is a very carefully worked out logical analysis around the concepts and how they fit together and so on. But as I get old and tired and grey, I get more and more convinced that that analysis has its place in the conversation around new technologies, but it is not central to those conversations. And it should not be central to those conversations, because it frames the issues in a particular way and omits a lot of considerations that are socially important, that matter to people, that people are emotionally invested in, and so on. So I note, for example, there is no contribution of theologians to this discussion, which is not something I personally am going to lose any sleep over, but they are important in some ways. And I point you to the overarching question to illustrate what I'm getting at. It says, for the proposed use, do the potential benefits outweigh the potential harms? Well, that's a very sensible question to ask, but so often it's the only question that's asked. And it frames the questions as essentially ones about either economic cost, or if we're thinking in philosophical terms, about utility. Now, I don't need to tell you that utilitarianism is only one school of thought in moral philosophy, and it's one which is particularly popular in the United Kingdom Anglosphere, but it wouldn't be taken quite so seriously if we were having this conversation in Germany or France or China, and with good reason. So if the setup is to say, right, we have a utilitarian framing of these questions, and what we're doing is weighing off harms and benefits, then you're going to get a certain sort of answer. You're going to get a certain sort of regulatory framework, and it's not going to broaden your perspective and capture those voices which are outside that stereotyped way of thinking about things. And you only have to read the newspapers in this country of mine, the United Kingdom, to see what happens when experts forget to listen to what the public are telling them. You end up in a terrible, terrible mess. And so I caution you to be a little less wedded to your standard paradigm of thinking about social issues. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Richard. Nick, please, thank you.
Thank you. So my name's Nick Mead. I'm Director of Policy at Genetic Alliance UK, which is the UK charity of more than 200 patient organisations supporting those living with rare genetic and undiagnosed conditions. I'm going to reflect on a few of our activities which I think feed into the work here. So the first is a collaboration that we did with the Progress Educational Trust, producing a report called Understanding Genome Editing, which presented attitudes of the patient and fertility community to genome editing and discussed the best way to engage with them. We participate in the regulation of PGD in the UK, which I think we'll hear more about from Peter Thompson shortly. We provide statements from the patient community on the impact of genetic conditions to them, to the HFEA, as they consider each condition by condition license. And finally, we do a lot of work on regulation and funding decisions for access to rare disease treatments and attitudes towards novel therapies, which I think have some parallels here that I'll reflect upon. Genetic Alliance UK is the national alliance member of Eurodis. We work with Eurodis on this topic, and I am here in part representing them. The first thing I wanted to bring up was one of the things we said in our report was that when discussing uses of genome editing, we should distinguish clearly between current and future uses, research and treatment, and uses that are currently permitted and uses that would require regulatory change. And I think I just want to underline the fact that essentially we're here talking about the transition between some of those stages. And I think the call for clarity applies too to the progress in making the decision to move from one to the other as well. And I think it will be important that the work here and in future decision making, that we're as transparent as possible and as clear as possible, and work to make sure that the community of people living with rare and genetic conditions understand what's going on. I then want to come on to the proposed taxonomy of potential uses. So the first three of these are different categories of monogenic conditions. I'd like to gently suggest that these overlap to such a degree that they might not be useful to separate out. So essentially that B and C can also, I wonder if we could get those on the slides.
You put my slides on, I can flick through. Thank
So
you.
there's the first one is monogenic conditions with life-threatening or severe health consequences. And the second is monogenic conditions that increase the risk of serious disease. And it's important to recognise that some of the consequences of living with a genetic risk factor for cancer, say, can be so burdensome that the screening, for example, and the frequent surgeries that are necessary to cater for dealing with having an increased risk become a serious burden of disease in themselves. And then I think to separate out the monogenic conditions that affect quality of life from the other two might not be helpful, given that the impact upon quality of life can be so challenging. I want to just share how we prepare our statements on the impact of conditions on patients for the HFEA. We essentially ask our community, as individuals and the members that we work with, to reflect on why a condition might be serious, and that includes life expectancy, pain and discomfort to the individual, impact on daily life of the symptoms of the condition, impact on daily life of management and treatment of the condition, the risks associated with treatment, the efficacy of the treatment, psychosocial impacts, looking after and being different from others, and how management of the condition might make one feel different from others, the time of the impact, at what point in your life does the condition affect you, impact upon parents and family, and the potential historical impacts of the condition on the family. To move on to the societal questions, I want to share some of the comments from the survey responses we've had briefly. So essentially this is a a point in reference to the disability rights argument that was raised yesterday. I think it's important to show the perspective of our community. Essentially, we have a series of patient organisations who spend the majority of their time advocating for and caring for people living with genetic conditions, but who also support advocacy for reproductive choice within their community. And I think it's important when considering reproductive choice to reflect upon the specific impact of conditions on people. So here's just a couple of statements that we've fed through to the HFEA quotes, and we have permission to use these for policy purposes, but I've taken out reference to specific conditions. So quote, "Some days I hurt from when I open my eyes in the morning until I take enough medicines to eventually fall asleep again that night. If we could prevent a person from feeling like that, we have a moral obligation to do it." Second quote, "As well as medical issues, you also have to overcome the fact you look different to everyone else. I would always worry for my son if he had a child that they would be born with this condition. It is not an easy condition to live with on a daily basis. It's a very difficult condition, and if a couple can choose to be free of it, this is only a good thing." And third quote, "Difficulty having healthy children is not something people with this condition deserve. It's horrible that after fighting so hard to recover from infections, chemotherapy and side effects, that they currently have to risk having children that will suffer as they have." And the second societal question that was raised was what other factors such as cost, access and healthcare disparity should be considered in evaluating the desirability of pursuing the intended use. Inequity was raised at a project that Eurodis are running at the moment about looking into the future, Rare 2030. And it's a serious concern for the rare disease community. It currently exists between nations, within nations, in regional disparity, and between genetic conditions. So certain genetic conditions receive better treatment by healthcare services than others due to historical commissioning arrangements, and that's certainly the case in the UK. And in the UK, we do not have full access to pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which so many speakers so far have drawn strong parallels with. So and then finally, medicine access. We're making a lot of progress in gene therapy, cell therapy, and still small molecule therapies for rare diseases. That access is not guaranteed across the world. In the UK, we're particularly bad at funding rare disease medicines quickly. There's a treatment for phenylketonuria, for example, that's available in every European country apart from the UK. So to let that factor hold us back seems like a mistake. And then I think onto the burden of, existence of effective treatments. I think it's important to consider the burden of existing treatments, and Sarah made this point earlier, but bone marrow transplantation for severe combined immunodeficiency has a greater than 90% success rate if we know the child's going to be affected. But would you rather avoid giving your child a bone marrow transplantation? The diet for phenylketonuria is pretty much totally effective, but the burden upon a family of delivering that diet is challenging in the extreme. Having to persuade a child that they can't have their birthday cake, for example, but on a daily basis. And then gene therapy for thalassemia, that works, but would you rather just not go through that and avoid the birth instead of a child affected instead? The choice should be there. And then finally, involving patients in decision making. The EMA does this in 4 ways. So it consults patients in how to design a decision making process. It lets patients put evidence to decision making committees as experts on an equal footing to other experts. It involves patients in the decision-making process as members of its decision-making committee. And then, of course, the 4th way is that patients have choice as to whether to adopt treatment. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick. Helen, if I can invite you to make some comments now.
Thank you. My name is Helen O'Neill and I am a lecturer in reproductive and molecular genetics, and I am Director of Reproductive Science and Women's Health at University College London. I'm also the very fortunate adopter of CRISPR genome editing in the laboratory, and I'm very grateful for its benefits for excelling my research in ways that previously could not have been done. I unfortunately used the very old methods, only considered 5 years old, and that took me a lot longer to achieve what I can now achieve in essentially 2 weeks. And I want to go back to the original question here, which is the components of a clinical or translational pathway. And there are many components of a clinical or translational pathway, and from the outset, these fall into two camps: those that we can control and those that we cannot control. Now, the ones that we can ostensibly control are those that we face in the lab. The ones that we cannot are innate biological errors. Ensuring experimental standards are of clinical caliber is crucial prior to the introduction of germline genome editing to the clinic. However, if we are to police scientific progress based on the potential to go wrong, then human nature, we have to account for the specious standards of human nature. With 15% of all clinically recognized pregnancies ending in the first trimester, and 25% of all total pregnancies ending before a birth, human reproduction has a high failure rate. We have to take this into account when we are dealing with providing standards for experimental outcomes. This, coupled with the seemingly inevitable 3% of babies that will be born with some genetic defect, it appears that something must be done for these inevitable 8 million babies born annually. When methods exist for prediction, maybe we should do something for prevention. We are not dealing with one technology when we talk about germline genome editing, and we have to account for the fact that we are dealing with a multitude of co-evolving technologies. I will speak on 3 of these technologies. The first is genome editing, the second is assisted reproductive technology, and the third is genome sequencing. Not so long ago, we said if only it were cheap enough to sequence a whole genome, then we could check every embryo. Now it is affordable to sequence the whole genome of every individual embryo. Assisted reproductive technologies, we can benefit from the 40 years that this has been in existence. There have been many mistakes made, and yet we see from some of the clinical trials presented this morning that actually long-term follow-up studies have been relatively scant. But if we were to know then what we do now, would we still have continued on? I think if you ask the 8 million babies that have been born, or the 16 potential million parents, it would be a resounding yes. And that does not account for the millions of others, or countless others, who were given hope. Hope which they were not previously exposed to in any sense. But back to the components of genome editing. There are many moving parts, and it is critical that we acknowledge these moving parts of genome editing. It is very easy to take a headline which says CRISPR causes off-target effects, unwanted edits, cancer. These are very dangerous when it comes to the technology and its actual application in the laboratory. The various components of genome editing within the lab are very varied, and I want you to take a minute just to appreciate the different aspects of these. We can all account for interoperative variability, and these are exactly the same kinds of situations that we would see in the assisted reproduction laboratory. Peter Brody spoke yesterday about the various hurdles that we can come across when it comes to procurement of eggs, ensuring that those eggs are mature enough, fertilizing those eggs, ensuring that the standards in which they are grown, be it culture media, conditions, and user operability, are of clinical standards. Once you get to the point of fertilization, you still need to wait until they reach the blastocyst stage. Up to 50% of embryos will not reach this stage. This is innate, but we can only presume this from innate and assisted reproduction of blastocysts. The point beyond which, as Kathy pointed out yesterday, We do not know about the effects of the things that we are doing in the laboratory to these embryos because many of the studies that were done did not allow those embryos to grow beyond the 8-cell stage. So the testing that was done on these embryos was done at the cleavage stage. The components that I want to refer to when we are talking about germline genome editing, if you take the components of assisted reproduction to one side, when we are talking about editing an embryo, there are not many different aspects to what you would do to an embryo compared to what is currently done in the assisted reproductive lab. However, the components that have changed and are ever changing are the mode of delivery. What are we putting into this embryo and how are we doing it? There are many ways to achieve this. We can use nanoparticles, we can electroporate the embryo, we can use intracytoplasmic sperm injection, we can use microinjection, to name a few. This is the method of delivery, the mode of delivery. Are we going to put in ribonucleoprotein complexes? Are we going to put in DNA? Are we putting in RNA? Are we putting in viral vectors to achieve our editing outcome? Again, there's a wide range of editing techniques. On the subject of editing techniques, what is our desired outcome? Are we hoping to make an introduction of DNA? To remove DNA? Are we hoping to correct the DNA? Will this involve the break of the double-stranded DNA, or will we adopt newer methods of prime editing where you do not have to break the actual double-stranded DNA? Methods to unwind the DNA and correct it as it is. In which case, the same issues that were presented in previous papers, in previous headlines, which says CRISPR causes insert unwanted effect, are no longer valid or relevant. The other aspect that we need to incorporate is timing. At what time are you going to insert your genome editing components into the embryo? This has an effect on the outcome. Some studies have shown that if you introduce it at the exact same time as you are introducing the sperm through intracytoplasmic sperm injection, that this is the most beneficial way, as you are going to ensure that the incorporation of that edit happens at every subsequent cell division. But this is not true of innate biology. There is a distinction that must be made between mosaicism, which is frequently used. Mosaicism should be referred to as genomic mosaicism when using CRISPR genome editing, and that is the mosaicism in which where the edit that you have made has not faithfully replicated in each cell division, and mosaicism that is innate in every human embryo. We are walking mosaics. Not every cell in every embryo, and certainly not every cell in every body, is the same and carries the same genetic complement. The cell type is another example, and this is where we reach a limitation in our understanding and our ability to prove a clinical outcome or a clinical translational pathway. We are very restricted in our ability to control. A control in its very essence means that you have a number of the same experimental subjects that are subject to the same and potentially one different outcome. When every single embryo has an incredibly different genome, how can we control for the outcomes that we are going to subject that embryo to? If we take embryonic stem cells, then these react very differently. If we are to use these as our control of that embryo, well then, what is the genetic difference between a plate of embryonic stem cells, between its first passage, when they've grown and been split, the second passage, when they've grown and split, and the third? There is a huge genetic difference between the first, third, 10th passage of these cells. So we are limited in our understanding of how we can compare innate genetic differences within cell types and within embryos, and those that we have conferred using genome editing. So I want to add with this that we no longer have just the complexity of these different components of genome editing to account for, but to also control for in certain ways. I am not highlighting these as a way to say that this should not be done. The opposite. I am highlighting these to say we must be evolutionary in our thinking, to say actually all of these components are ever moving. More and more bacterial genomes have been sequenced so that we can find better CRISPR mechanisms, better endonucleases, different methods of cutting the DNA. And within a very short time, we have already witnessed an exponential increase of different tools in the CRISPR toolbox. These have to be accounted for, but also the ongoing evolution of assisted reproductive technology. This co-evolution of technologies is critical. We are not just using one technology on its own. We are standing on the shoulders of giants. And I'm going to go back to some of Nick's comments about the patients. Technologies like this, just as assisted reproduction did, give patients hope. And I want to ask you, at what point do patients deserve a genetic minimum? And at what point will good be good enough? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. So if I can now invite Peter Thompson to give his view from the HF.
Thanks very much, Kay. My name's Peter Thompson, and I'm a career civil servant, which I appreciate in some circumstances is a bit like declaring one is an alcoholic at a meeting of AA. More to the point, I'm the Chief Executive of the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority, and have been so since 2010. And as many of you will know, that is the statutory regulatory body for ART in the UK and research involving human embryos, thank you, Peter, and the first body of its kind in the world. And I've also worked for a number of other government departments. So I come at this question as a regulator and about concerns about what is practical, both at the clinic and the regulatory level, and what can command public trust. So I come at this in a very kind of rooted way, and I don't come at it with a lot of notes because I wanted to hear what colleagues will say, and I'll try and pick my way through that as we go. But I think some assumptions are worth stating, because I think if these assumptions aren't met, certainly in a UK context and probably elsewhere, then I think we are in a theoretical rather than a potentially a practical debate. I don't see moving forward on the use of these sorts of techniques in treatment without questions of safety and efficacy having been sufficiently resolved, and that's clearly an open question. We're not talking about absolute measures, but a sense that something is safe enough. I think at this stage we must only be considering the treatment of serious inherited disease, which logically means that questions of human enhancement are off the table. And it seems to me if those assumptions don't hold, then this discussion is going nowhere, certainly for the foreseeable. So thinking then, how does one sort of make a move from this into something that looks like law? And it seems to me there's three kind of phases here, and I will get to the questions, the framework you've raised. And I think one way of thinking about this process is thinking about three stages. There's a kind of broadly public stage, which we're clearly in part. There's a law-making stage, and Peter's right about other parts of the world and rules, and I'll come to that later. And there's a kind of downstream regulatory stage. And the public stage has a whole bundle of things like commissions like this going on, and it often involves, quite rightly, some pretty detailed work on the science, and Peter's already referred to the work he and colleagues did for us on mitochondrial transfer, in which there was a kind of sense in which we were trying to get to an answer. Do we know enough collectively that it would be a reasonable thing to move forward, which goes to the hearts of your potential benefits and risks questions? And at the same time along that, there's a sort of opportunity, in fact, I think an obligation in something like this, to engage with the public. And there are a whole variety of pretty sophisticated ways one can do that in order to get a sense of where the public is, not in a crude kind of yes-no sort of measure, but a sense of what is it that troubles them or not about these particular propositions, which goes to the heart of Peter's comments, about really clear about what it is you want to do. What is this for? And questions of what you want to do and for are also questions about what you don't want to do, what you're prepared to rule out. That kind of stuff seems to me for, if I'm a government minister, I'm advising a government minister, that kind of work on a subject like this seems to me to be essential before one's even considering the prospect of making a legal change. And certainly in the UK, you'd need to make a legal change to allow that. And that combination of a scientific assessment and a broader public discussion are where the components of this sort of trust conversation goes. Because in the end, when you make law on something like this, you're making a kind of bargain. You're saying to the people who do this work, you can do it as long as you accept a certain degrees of oversights and rules and conditions and the like, of which the 14-day rule is a really good example. And it's really striking, as you say, the way in which it's moved from a legal limit to something that's often broadly accepted more generally in a cultural sense amongst people doing the work. And it's that process of the kind of lawmaking that then allows you to set some sort of a regulatory framework against which individual decisions can be made. And so if you've got some of your questions in your pathway, I think relate to this earlier stage about how you want to frame the subject, and some of these questions relate to quite specific sort of downstream licensing questions. And it may be worth thinking about where they fit on this continuum, if my continuum's right. And Nick's already referred to this. It seems to me there already is, if this was handed to me tomorrow, I would start from where we are on PGD. PGD allows us to think quite precisely about not just obviously what is lawful, but where the particular scientific benefits bear down. To some extent, although it's not set in law, we consider the views of patients. And it allows us to answer questions around, particularly questions around seriousness and the like, which is crucial to our legislation. I'm not saying we would just straightforwardly copy this, but I think something around a very practical application of these kind of models could quite sensibly be applied to the kinds of techniques you're talking about. So, my sense is, and what I'm struck about, at least from a regulatory perspective, I don't think the regulatory issues that flow from CRISPR are radically different from the regulatory issues we grapple with on a weekly basis about PGD and mitochondrial replacement therapy. There are all sorts of other questions about CRISPR which are pretty profound, for sure, but at a regulatory level, if a society has decided it wants to move forward with this, the questions are not greatly different. So, and I think the other thing to think about in all of this is a sort of, how do you want to frame the rules? Because one can do this in a kind of permissive or a restrictive way. And you've already referred to the fact there may be numerous different techniques and they're developing very quickly and the like. So part of the dilemma for lawmakers is, do you sort of go technique specific, or do you try to rule out, are you trying to legislate for an area of activity and you're trying to put parameters around it? That's a very different question. Now, this may seem an odd link, but for those of you who know anything about devolution, there's a Scotland Act and there's a Wales Act. The Wales Act tells you exactly what the Welsh Assembly can do. The Scotland Act tells you what the Scottish Parliament can't do. If you go to the Scotland Act and look for what the Scottish Parliament does, it doesn't actually tell you very much at all. It just tells you what the UK government can do, and therefore everything else is a matter for the Scottish Parliament. The conditions are entirely reversed in Wales. There are all sorts of questions here about what you want to be doing is setting a framework about what is unacceptable and leaving a space there for the acceptable, or do you wish to do the reverse? So I think if I view your pathway, I think the questions here are, many of them I think are very sensible. I think Nick's point about some of them I think are unpacked to a degree that you possibly don't need. I think if I was a politician, I would be enormously interested in things like intended clinical purpose. That seems to me to be essential. I think where we are, I think the alternative clinical approaches question is essential, because I think in the world where we are, where PGD works, not all the time for sure, but we're around about 500 licensed conditions in this country at the moment. What was certainly true in the mitochondrial debate was establishing the idea that there was a patient population who did not have existing clinical options. Because I think it is a very brave politician to move from the known and the safe to the unknown. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, there are several very important points and challenges in those presentations, so thank you very much to all the speakers. Perhaps I could ask the commissioners if they'd like to make comments first, and then anyone in the public, because we've got a public session at noon. Rick.
Thank you. These are all terrific. Peter, I'd like to ask you your thoughts about the difference between PGD and genome editing. You likened them as being quite similar. We don't typically worry about, perhaps for ill outcome, but apparently not. The consequence of the possibility of genetic alterations occurring from PGD, whereas there are potential risks of altering the genome in unintended ways from CRISPR. So how would you think about the equivalence of those if you were considering saying, oh, well, we're just going to start using CRISPR tomorrow rather than PGD?
Because I'm assuming that we've got to a place where we're comfortable on the basic scientific questions. When I talk about regulatory questions, what I'm talking about is a decision to allow treatment in particular cases. Now, I'm assuming, therefore, that regulatory conversation isn't even taking place until the prior questions have been largely satisfied. Now, clearly, we can't know everything, and there may well be unintended consequences. And I think where there is a regulatory complication is actually thinking about the kind of enforcement route, or what do you do to cope with unintended consequences? Whereas I agree that PGD is, if you like, a more containable subject. But what I'm trying to allude to is when you get down to actual licensing decisions, you're asking a series of tests around things like, in a UK, I'm not saying the UK model is the only model, but we're asking questions around, is it lawful? Does it meet the various tests in the Act? Is this being done by people who are appropriately qualified in laboratories that are licensed and so on? There's a whole bundle of questions which actually strike me as being entirely pertinent and relevant were we got to a place more generally where we thought that genome editing was an acceptable way forward.
Would you think about requiring some demonstration of equivalence or non-inferiority or superiority
in the technique, you mean?
Compared to PGD, yes. So right now, you could make the argument that we have PGD.
Yeah.
What is the necessity if, unless you have 100% of embryos that are going to be genetically affected, what would be the need for use of genome editing instead of simply going with PGD?
Yeah, and I think that's quite a powerful art. I think in a political sense with a small p, these techniques potentially come to the fore or become serious contenders where either they are very much more efficient than the existing alternatives or they offer treatment options which aren't available.
Thank you.
I think Peter would like to come in on that question.
It's quite interesting when you look at the history of PGD because you're making some assumptions about its safety and so on.
Yes,
when PGD started in the 1990s, in fact, it was exactly the same time the Act was being debated and Robert Winston and Alan were lucky enough to get it to work. It had been discussed for years before. There were no trials. There's only been a couple of mouse experiments that suggested it may be okay. It would not pass muster now, okay? But what you've now got is a significant usage experiment, if you like. We still haven't followed up the babies well enough. We do follow ours up and look at various things along the way. But generally it is not. And it already got shot off down another route called pre-implantation genetic screening, which, as I explained yesterday, is what 60% of biopsies are done for, and a large number in the United States. That technology works very well, and your question is absolutely right. You'd have to have very, very specific conditions to turn around and say, this is better. And the same thing happened with MRT. So MRT came along, into the idea of mitochondrial transfer of genetic disease. You've got a bunch of diseases there which you could try applying PGD, but it either was unsuccessful or just couldn't be done because of the technology. And the net effect was, the decision was made is if you cannot do PGD for this, would it be worth moving to the other one? A lot of debate and thought, and eventually getting to the point that says, well, let's go ahead and see. We realize it might be unsafe. We knew that on the committee, but we'll go ahead and try it and see what happens, and we want long-term follow-up, which I know Doug got the money to do, really long-term follow-up to find out what this is about. If you were to put genome editing in the same thing with the same scrutiny and the same requirements afterwards because there was nothing else to do, and I still, as you heard from Francis yesterday, there are extremely few conditions that I can think of where you really, really can't use PGD. You may be able to do a little bit better, I don't know, but there may be some other downsides that aren't so good.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Eric was going and then Andy.
Thank you. First, thank you very much for a very thoughtful panel. I had a couple of questions, maybe to follow up on this discussion. You know, we're looking at the safety issues, off-target effects, et cetera. But with regard to your question, Dr. Thompson, about, well, it kind of is like PGD, I think the way it's not like PGD is in PGD you have a few choices of embryo that you might choose from. In this, you have an infinite set of possibilities of 1,000 genes you might tweak to potentially affect intelligence or make X-ray resistant astronauts or other things. Happy birthday to your 2-year-old granddaughter, and I think it's a marvelous analogy here that we are going to confront not these finite choices, but this infinite collection of things. And you guys, I think, have in your mind the notion that we're only going to be debating the couple of cases where PGD might not deliver on the things that we already wish it would deliver on. But of course, the questions before us are to think about this much wider range that I think do push us beyond the regulatory questions we've thought about. So that's just one set of questions. I guess maybe I'm going to combine that with the wonderful discussions of Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Mead. If it's the case right now that the vast majority of children who are born with serious genetic conditions are born to parents who didn't know at all, and that screening is the most urgent need, and if PGD solves the majority of the problems, but isn't used in the majority of cases, then as we think about the importance of these things, one might rank, let's make sure couples have information first as to whether they're at risk. Let's make sure couples have the knowledge and availability and practice of PGD. And then as the little tail, we can think about genome editing, but in terms of the energy and resources that might be devoted, would you say this is kind of a small bit compared to those first two? And then finally for Dr. Ashcroft, and then I'll let you all have at it, you told us all the things we shouldn't be doing. Bad utilitarians, or at least narrow utilitarians we are, and talking Elsie already prejudges many things, but you didn't tell us what we should be doing. I was taking notes and I didn't get the instructions of what we ought to do. Anyway, those were my reactions to a wonderful panel.
Thank you, Eric. Who would like to go first?
I'd like to tackle you on the PGD thing. Dr. Land, I don't think you were here yesterday when I spoke about the PGD. Right. What is crucial is you're still going to do PGD. Yes. Okay? You're still going to be biopsying it, unless you're so confident about your genome editing that you can just chuck it at the embryos and you'll say, that's going to be fine. You're going to be doing the same thing with all the pitfalls, unless the technology of doing assisted reproduction changes, which I hope it will. There are lots of areas it can. You're still going to be doing it. So your advantage is small in terms, other than for those where you think it won't work, okay? All these other things you're talking about, why do you want to do them? And that's what I put to you right at the beginning. Why do you want to do these? I'm not quite sure. I don't see that, but maybe because I'm just old, all right? But maybe in the future you want to put people on another planet, and that's maybe a good reason for doing it. But I think they are analogous in asking why you can do it. And MRT is quite an interesting one because that's been looked at because it is transgenerational. And if you're looking at the new mutations, are you going to be testing every kid with a heel prick at birth, which is something being discussed in this country, so you will have their full whole genome sequence, and you can decide before people get married, you'll quickly do a thing. We already do that in countries around the world where you test for sickle disease or test for thalassemia and decide what's a good idea to get married. So, and have children. You can get married if you want. But the issue comes is how you're going to take it forward and what is realistic and what is now. Because in 10 years' time, it's going to be a different discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
I'll let others speak because Peter's covered the ground as I would on that.
Richard, would you like to?
Guilty as charged. And I do apologise. But thank you for challenging me. I think there's two things I can say to sort of elaborate a more constructive approach. One is to just say, well, fish from a wider pool of people giving evidence. But the other thing to say is, as I didn't mention in my biography, that I was one of the people on the working party at the Nuffield Council on Bioethics on the germline, genome editing and human reproduction. And this is something we wrestled with at every single meeting, is how do you fit together the sort of evidence that we would get from, say, disability rights groups or from religious groups with the kind of evidence we would get from scientists, medics, a certain kind of philosopher who, under almost all circumstances, I would consider myself. So I'm trying to think outside my own assumptions here, if that makes sense. And how you fit that kind of evidence together, because it's almost as if the intellectual paradigm doesn't exist for asking these two different kinds of questions. So I suppose all I'm asking of you is an acknowledgement of that difficulty.
Okay, thank you. Is there any quick comments from Nick and Helen?
Yes, I do want to comment on the interchangeability between the use of PGD and germline genome editing, and also pick up on Peter's comments to say that if we did germline genome editing, we would need to do PGD anyway, unless we were so sure that the genetic edit we made was there and faithful. And yet, every day in the IVF laboratory, we are so sure about the embryos that we transfer back to a woman's uterus that are going to lead to a pregnancy, and yet the success rate is 30% at most. We take these risks and are so sure about certain things without knowing the genetic complement of the cell or of these cells anyway. And with the need for using PGD anyway, this ignores the progress in other fields of non-invasive prenatal or pre-implantation testing. And Catherine spoke yesterday about their research and ongoing research in Spain, which shows that we can actually now faithfully detect certainly aneuploidies from the culture media in which the embryos are grown. And so there may be, in future down the line, no need to actually invasively interrogate an embryo to find out its genetic components. So maybe there won't be a need.
Thanks. And just a quick point, and maybe to make quite a blunt point that I think a lot of the speakers yesterday were leading towards, which is from the patient community perspective, we're talking about a hypothetical new way to do artificial reproductive choice. And from the patient community's perspective, you're not going to choose to do this instead of PGD. You're coming to the clinic to ask to avoid the birth of an affected child. And the only reasons you might do it is if PGD won't work, if this might work better in the future, and if this is more acceptable to your personal beliefs on how to handle reproductive technology. So it's and that means if it's so similar from a patient perspective that we would then follow to treat it quite similarly in a regulatory way. But that's only from the perspective of trying to avoid the birth of a child affected by a serious genetic condition.
Thank you. Andy.
Yeah. So rather like Eric, I want to welcome Richard as a critical friend, because I think critical friendships are really important. And I don't like being in rooms with people that agree with me. It actually is quite a rare experience, to be honest. And I want you to go a bit further in terms of your positive suggestions. And I guess my question is, so the reason why we're talking about PGD and genome editing at the same time is both are techniques which get parents to decide which type of children are born. That's the fundamental question, right? That's what fundamentally makes them ethically challenging. Which types of children should be born? And that's why we're talking about them both at the same time. So what would it look like if we had a system now that was just? If we had a just system, would we have an HFEA? Would we be doing PGD?
Gosh, there's a PhD for somebody. So, where you might start with that is by looking at the question, which actually has been asked many times before, but never very conclusive answer to it, which is, what difference does it make to exercise choice over the characteristics of the child that you're going to have? What difference does it make? And parents do this all the time, prospective parents do this all the time, but the difference between standard reproduction the old-fashioned way and the reproduction through the laboratory using genome editing and other technologies we are more familiar with already is the balance between choice and chance. The balance between the sense that you have a control over what you expect to happen and the sense that we don't know and we hope for the best. So Helen's data I find very suggestive here, that we have an idea that we have more control than truly we actually do, even with these new technologies. Now, how does that relate to justice? It relates to justice in the sense that if you think, on the one hand, that you have control, that creates a context around responsibility. So that's not a question of distributive justice, it's a question of justice in equality of regard and esteem for the people that come into the world through that method. And it also establishes a certain kind of attitude around choice, chance, control, authority, and so on. So the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas published a book about 20 years ago now, which was much satirized in the Anglo-American bioethics world, as the great man has gone into a subject he knows nothing about and what a terrible book he's achieved. But he did ask some interesting questions about what difference it would make if we moved into a world where parents, by and large, had predetermined what kind of children they wanted to have. And that changed all kinds of things, in Habermas's view, about how social equality is supposed to work. If we are all, in some sense, different from one another by design, rather than having rather a lot in common, and all of that in a space where it is not under human control. It changes the social conversation in ways that we aren't ready to deal with.
Thank you. If you can have a question from Julie, then Doug, and then I think we can open it out to the rest of the audience before we conclude this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not very agree with what I've said on PGD, because PGD doesn't solve the majority of the problem. I have to remember that 2 out of 3 of the couples we take in charge in PGD do not have a healthy child at the end of the procedure. So I think that in the future, of course not now, but in the future, if we start with the couple who do not have alternative, and if it happens to work and to be safe, gene editing will be one way to improve the PGD procedure. I do agree with Helen. It's not easy to do PGD, and it's not very efficient. It's not a very good alternative, in fact.
Any quick comments, or perhaps we can take Doug's question and then you can have time for final comments after any other questions.
I'm very conscious that we're supposed to be an international commission, and we've actually heard a very view. Inevitably, we're in the UK in a highly regulated environment. I was just curious to ask Peter Thompson about the way in which he perceives other countries. And we know there's a lack of regulation, but I'm just wondering, is there any, amongst the regulators, is there any move to try and internationalize? Because I get a slightly nihilistic feeling about this, that whatever we do, it'll be great, it'll work in certain people that are certain countries where they're happy to regulate, and then it'll be unregulated elsewhere. And I just wondered what Peter felt about more international.
Peter?
not hugely positive, is the honest answer, Doug. No, the reason I say that is because in the end, it seems to me this is an area of public policy which is highly specific to individual societies. So countries have very particular histories about these things, and that shapes their attitudes. And, you know, this is not about collaboration between regulators, because you don't even get the regulators on the pitch until there's an agreement to have them. So, you know, the fact that I might be able to reach some agreement with a couple of other regulators elsewhere in the world doesn't solve the problem more widely. And international agreements on all sorts of things are notoriously difficult, and you tend to end up with the lowest common denominator anyway. So I'm more interested, actually, in Peter's implication, at least, about the development of, or I have more, in terms of the short term, about Peter's development of a kind of, if you like, a common culture amongst researchers and clinicians. Now, that's not to suggest there aren't people outside of that kind of common culture, but I think it is quite possible that, you know, regulatory rules in one place do get taken up through professional practice elsewhere, not because they're fixed rules, but because they get seen as being, if you like, responsible behaviour. And one of the ways in which people mark themselves out with their peers is about this sense that they're on that side of the line rather than the other side of the line. Now, you know, that's not to suggest that there aren't always possibilities. I mean, Peter's slide about, you know, this is perfectly true just for ordinary IVF. People leave the UK to have things elsewhere that they can't have in the UK. Now, whether or not that means we've got the balance right or wrong in the UK, they have personal freedom to do so, and there are various places in the world, for example, you can go and have a baby of a particular sex, which for the most part you can't in this country. They're exercising freedom of choice.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor? Yes? And then another one at the back, and I think then...
I'm Sandy Starr from the Progress Educational Trust. On the question of whether conditions are sufficiently serious to warrant the use of reproductive technologies, I'd like to just suggest bending the stick in the other direction to some of what's been said, drawing on what some of Sarah Chan said in the previous session. So there's been a lot of discussion yesterday and today of the circumstances in which germline genome editing could solve problems that established technologies like PGD cannot solve. And it's been argued that these circumstances are rare, but it occurs to me that this is based on the assumption that what we're aiming for is an unaffected child. What if our aim is both to avoid having an unaffected child, but also to avoid the child being a carrier of a recessive condition? Might we sort of recalibrate our expectations of the technology in line with that? The fact we haven't been focused on carrier status before might not be because it was wrong to do so, it just wasn't practicable. And maybe with genome editing it will be practicable. I'd be interested in any thoughts on that.
Any quick thoughts from the panel?
Certainly technologies are evolving for doing expanded carrier screening. These should be put into a certain case box in which the more you test for or the more you look, the more you find. And what is dangerous about this, and similar with whole genome sequencing, is that very often there are things that we don't know. These variants of unknown significance are one thing, but other things that we just don't know what the relevance is in that future couple. So when you do expanded carrier screening, the more you look for within a given couple, the more variants that both couples or both individuals within that couple are going to carry. And you almost limit yourself or stunt yourself in your ability to treat them or help them have a reproductively safe child, because you've all of a sudden highlighted things that actually chance would have deemed possibly negligible. But knowledge means you have this burden of knowledge when you have to do something about it. So I think you need to be a bit careful with expanded carrier screening, and certainly the level to which you are going to do this carrier screening or screen for.
Okay, a quick comment from Nick and then Peter, and then we'll take the final question of the session.
Just to say that the most dangerous thing about being a carrier is not knowing that you're a carrier. And I think once we know that, you can get a bit more relaxed about having a carrier status.
If I can answer Sandy, there was a deliberate move because the issue was that you were trying to avoid a condition in the child. Now, whereas Andy picked up on the idea that these may not be serious and that you're trying to make a distinction, there are some that are serious. The children die, okay? SMN1, the children die. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the children will die. It seems to be very careful when you look at those things. It's quite obvious that there's a straightforward need. There are some more grey areas which I think is more difficult. But carrier was, the reason we don't select out carriers is because that is a eugenic activity. Effectively, you will have treatments in 20 years' time that will deal with carriers. It might be genome editing for those individuals. I don't know. It also was a numbers game. But that brings me back to the comment that was made about PGD not working. There's an assumption it is the PGD's problem. It's not the PGD problem. The women come when they're older. You can't get eggs from them. Germline genome editing can do nothing for that. Once you get eggs, the only difference you're going to make is you may have a slightly bigger cohort. It doesn't be that much bigger, but you'll have a bigger cohort. They may go down at a later stage when you have problems with your genome editing. And I think the numbers, again, of what I tried to elicit in my talk, saying that 2 out of 3 don't go home with the baby is not true. If you start to do cumulative effects, you will see, and I showed you the numbers, there are real numbers in a unit doing 500 cases a year. I looked at the papers looking at germline genome editing in terms of are there conditions that should be done. The total number that was done by this clinic, which is said to be very good, was 200 in their lifetime of the clinic. You're talking of 1,000 babies being born in something like, I don't know, Karen will probably tell me, 2,500 cycles. Those are real numbers, okay? It's not 2 out of 3 fail.
Okay, I think we have to leave that debate there and just take the last question at the back of the room. Thank you.
Last question, pressure. Just a question to the 2 Peters. The trust work has been fantastic for all this meeting. It's been great. I loved the third of our key findings is that when governance is not trusted or is considered untrustworthy, it's because it's failed to consider the way the real world works. And your compelling photo of your granddaughter said that very well. I wanted to ask as well, I'm on this Agile Governance Council of the WEF. Do you feel that in addition to self-reflection tools and those types of things, that governance needs to do different things in order to really understand the way the world really works and so for example your points about how people will be doing these sorts of edits anyway, what do we do about it? It requires a different sort of governance and a different angle to look at things in some ways, and I wondered if you think we have the right tools for that and how we could do something differently to avoid that sort of rational choice mindset that sometimes leads us astray.
Thank you.
You're the regulator. You go first.
All right. Trust. I think there's a danger here in putting too much faith in particular ways of engaging with wider public in order to get to particular outcomes. And I think that just as there will be enormous development of, if you like, clinical kind of opportunities, this is very much an evolving field, and I don't subscribe to the view that you engage with the public in a particular way in order to get an answer. A big part of this is about actually whether you're even a trusted participant to engage with the public in the first place. Many big public engagement exercises in this country and elsewhere have failed not because the engagement was poorly run, because frankly people didn't trust the people having the conversation in the first place, or that they believed that the question had been answered in the first place. What was striking, I think, about the work we did on mitochondria, which complements the work that Peter and others did on the scientific stuff, is the public engagement work genuinely didn't start from we managed to establish a place of trust, which was not that we were looking for a particular answer. We were really interested, A, in what people thought, and B, we spent a great deal of time on the process of getting them through the answer. In other words, we were interested in, what they thought or knew about the world before they'd had any exposure to information. What kind of processes might help them get a better understanding, and we also spent quite a lot of time getting them to talk to each other. And actually what you find often in this trust process is different participants help them come to some kind of settlement around an idea, and that's actually much more powerful than me standing up there and telling people stuff. You need to give people time. There's a whole bunch of techniques there, and I don't think one should be too fixated on one over another and say it's a developing field. focus on, this is about winning a kind of, or creating a space where people trust that the conversation is meaningful, and this isn't just a tick box exercise in which you can then go back and say, don't worry, I talked to a load of people and 63% of them said X. Yes. That's not the starting point.
Is it
very brief? Just two things. One is, we heard that perhaps the public aren't very trustful of people doing this. But on the other hand, we're in a climate at the moment where policy decision makers are very suspicious of experts. They don't listen to them anymore, look at climate change, etc., etc. But the other thing I think that is missing is consistency. Because, and I'm going to pick America just because it's easy to do, America is silent on ART, it disallows MRT, and it now wants a pathway for genome editing. So I don't see how that's at all consistent. You've got three total similar techniques, all of which you've got totally different ways of dealing with.
And that surprises you?
No, it doesn't surprise me, but it gives you a way to decide how you're going to deal with this, or at least ask some questions.
Robin, did you have a comment? And then there's another commissioner that would like, well, maybe the commissioner should ask first, and then Robin can have a quick comment, because we must conclude the session so the public have an opportunity.
All right, thank you. It's been very stimulating, but I think it's so complicated because I think there are two layers of issues. One is we think about the risk benefit evaluation from a science and technology perspective and case-by-case perspective. But on the other hand, as a commission, if we set up a pathway, that's not only, even we have a very strict limitation of the indication, it will tell the world this is a way to move forward. And people will take it in a very different way. So you have a fundamental impact for the whole society, global society. And we heard so much talk in UK. I think it's a great society, you have perfect regulation. But still,
excuse me, you heard that?
I heard it.
And also the last panel talked about so much about a very nice study about the cultural long-term follow-up. But that's going to be so different, different culture system, different political system.
Yeah.
So, but whatever we're going to make here, although have no much of enforcement, but it will have a profound effect for those society. And literally, those society will pass their genetic material to UK potentially. So, just a comment.
Okay, very quickly, and then
two quick points. On the one hand, you're absolutely right. There certainly is an argument which says if something changes radically somewhere, it creates the conditions in which the idea of change or even further change is more acceptable. That said, that also becomes an argument for never changing anything. I don't see how that problem is handleable. The other thing I would say is the experience of this field, in this country at least, suggests that slippery slopes are negotiable. Mary Warnock said something along the lines of, the question on slippery slopes is whether you're wearing crampons or skis. It's been, actually, crampons have been all right. And on the whole, it hasn't been that hard work to sort of stay in the places we wanted to stay.
Just Robin now, and then I think we have to close this, give other people an opportunity. And there are people online that may want to email things in. Robin.
It's really a question, I mean, you're going to say this anyway, where are you going to take this next? Because, the slides came up quite quick. There are other things, I'm sure, that could be added to your taxonomy list. We heard yesterday from Pierre Jurenet about perhaps mailing to give example. And then also, I didn't see anything about the sort of preclinical evidence that you might need to go forward. And so I assume you are going to be working on that. So
we are.
Will we all get a chance to input on this, I guess, is my question.
Yep. Well, we're looking forward to your comments on that, in fact. Yes.
Well, but okay. Will we be sent at some point? Will there be consultation?
No.
No.
First, let me thank the panel. It's been a very exciting session and very provoking. Thank you very much. I've been standing up for an hour, so you guys could stay sitting down, if you don't mind. In the interest of time, if we can now invite comments, brief comments from the public. just 50 minutes for that, and there may be people online that have sent things through that can be read out too. Who'd like to? Oh, we have someone. Okay, if you could just briefly say who you are and then make a comment, that would be very helpful.
So I'm Max Münke, and I'm a practicing pediatrician and geneticist, medical geneticist. One general comment, very quick, and then one very specific one for this conference. I think it's important to keep in mind 50% of children that are born are unplanned. Then, of those that are planned, or the ones that are unplanned, 2 to 4% have a birth defect, and that will not change if you do genomic editing. So you will be sure that this birth defect doesn't occur, but the risk for having the 2 to 4% is identical. And I think that's something to keep in mind. As a practicing pediatrician, I understand the wish for having a child, and I understand the wish for having a healthy child. So that's with the generic comment. I think the more specific comment is, first of all, this is an outstanding conference, and I want to thank the organizers for having people from almost all walks of life here, including those with genetic disabilities and those who are advocates for people with disabilities. I think, to me, having bioethicists, legal experts, OBGYNs on the panel, to me, is outstanding. I think what is missing, and here I speak as a representative of the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics, to have medical geneticists on this panel, and likewise practicing, in addition to practicing medical geneticists, to have practicing genetic counselors. So at the third session, I would highly recommend to have those two working groups as part of this commission here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone? Oh, you've got it.
We had Francis, who's a practicing clinic.
Okay, hello, I'm David King. I'm the director of a small pressure group called Human Genetics Alert. I'm someone who takes part in the public debates and in the media debates, as well as attending conferences like this. And I want to just say something about the difference between the two. I've been very pleased to hear, thanks to Professor Brody and Francis Flinter, that the Commission is seriously talking about the fact that PGD can do most of the work here. But when you go out into the public debate, when you look at the media, you get a very different story. You get the story that's presented. This was the way it was presented with mitochondrial replacement, and with a whole set of things before that. Is basically, we have to do this, otherwise lots of sick, children with horrible genetic diseases will be born. I'm sure that a lot of the scientists here would like to say, oh, well, that's not our fault. That's just the media misrepresenting us. In fact, there are people in this room who participated and perpetrated those ways of misleading the public. And I kind of don't really have the feeling that they're going to stop doing that. And so, you can do that. It's very effective, the piece of public propaganda to say, we must do this because, we're doctors and nice people and we want to prevent suffering. And, of course, everybody wants to prevent suffering. And it's an incredibly effective piece of public propaganda. When you can push any piece of rubbish science through the legislature. Take human-animal hybrid embryos 10 years ago. Utter scientific nonsense. Push through Parliament, and then the Medical Research Council rejected it. So you can do that, and it's very effective, but it's not honest. And it's got nothing to do with science. And so I'd like to just challenge the Commission. What is the Commission going to do about that? Are you going to try and do better on that than that political machinery of pumping these things through public policy has done in the past?
Okay, thank you for that comment.
Yes, my name is Sandy Starr. I'm Deputy Director of the Progress Educational Trust, which is a charity that seeks to improve choices for people affected by infertility and genetic conditions. And it's very clear to us that genome editing in all its various forms has tremendous potential to help humanity. It's clear to us and to most people that when it comes to the clinical use of germline genome editing, He Jiankui set a bad example in China last year. claimed he was following in the footsteps of IVF pioneer Robert Edwards, and it was a false claim. Edwards wasn't perfect, but he didn't do his work secretively, and he adhered to far higher scientific and ethical standards. Now, it would be a mistake to react to what happened in China, to this bad example, by refusing ever to countenance the clinical use of germline genome editing in humans. Instead, we must think about learning from this bad example and setting good examples in future with transparent work done to clear and rigorous standards in order to pursue well-defined objectives. And the work of this Commission is an important step towards that situation. Now, we know from our charity's work with patients and the general public, as well as professionals from various backgrounds, that substantial numbers of people are positively disposed towards and cautiously optimistic about the potential of this technology, up to and including the possible future regulated clinical use of germline genome editing if it meets various standards, standards which this Commission will hopefully help to define. But we know from our work with our fellow charity Genetic Alliance UK that some of the terminology that surrounds genome editing is unnecessarily and confusingly inconsistent, and this can present an impediment to understanding and discussing this technology. So just finally, we've published a report entitled Basic Understanding of Genome Editing that provides recommendations for how best to discuss this technology using terminology that's both clear and accurate, and that can hopefully withstand and accommodate future developments in this fast-moving field, rather than our vocabulary having to be revised again and again with each new development and innovation. And we would exhort this Commission to take the recommendations of our Basic Understanding of Genome Editing report on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more comment.
Hi there. My name is Patrick Harrison. My research lab in Cork has been using zinc finger technology inspired by Dr. Carroll's work and CRISPR technology for the last 10 to 12 years. We're using it in the context of correcting mutations for cystic fibrosis in terms of trying to use this for somatic gene therapy. And one of the discussions that we have is about the safety. And my question or comment relates to the safety profile. To the best of my knowledge, there's only 6 people to date who've received somatic gene editing as part of an approved clinical trial for Hurler syndrome and Hunter syndrome. So the question relates to how safe does somatic gene editing need to prove itself, and how long will that take before regulations are put in place to approve germline gene editing, which would occur not only in every cell in the recipient's body, but in every sperm cell or every egg cell that that person would subsequently produce.
Thank you, and I think that's a question the Commission will take on. We're not going to go back to the panel now. Are there any other comments or comments from online?
I've not received any so far, but just to say, for anyone watching on the webcast, my email address is in the description of the YouTube page.
Thank you.
And my email address is also in the booklets for anyone attending here. So it's connieburge@royalsociety.org if anyone does want to send them in. But I keep refreshing, but nothing so far.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Connie. And I'd just like to thank everyone who's participated today, yesterday, and for the very interesting debate. Thank you very much, and to all the speakers. Thank you very much.